Okay, while the last few people are signing in, just a couple of housekeeping items. First thing, as you all know, we did have Teams crash on us at one point yesterday. Said we exceeded our time limit. I'm not really sure what that was all about. We hadn't been running the meeting very long at that point when we got that error. So if that happens again, just go back to the link, click back on that, and go back into the meeting. That seemed to work fine for everyone getting back in. So just keep that link handy, I guess, just in case, but hopefully we'll be good to go without that issue today. Then the second thing, someone did ask me about recordings. I am recording these meetings and they will be posted. Now, they are huge files. They're much bigger than can be emailed out. So we'll get them posted on a website and then I will send the link to you. I'll have to work with someone else in our state office to get that posted. But I will get you notification when the recordings are finished and when they are posted. And that way, if you want to go back and see anything again, you can do that. So likely early next week is when you can expect to see those recordings posted. And with that, I'd like to get started in the actual presentations that we have today. Our first talk is going to be on hydrology, and the talk is going to be given by Heather Smeltz and Mark Buckwater. Now, Heather and Mark are both civil engineers in the PA NRCS state office, and they both focus on dam work, dam design and construction. And I'm not sure if they're going to mention that much at all today or not, but they have a super interesting job, in my opinion, where they get to work on really large engineering projects. So Heather and Mark, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Tim. When you give an intro like that, you may want to be careful that DAM is DAM. Although we've been called the other kind of dam engineers before too. So
just trying to keep people guessing. They don't really know.
And wake them up first thing in the morning. So Mark should be sharing his screen and you should be seeing our hydrology presentation. And Mark, if you want to go all the way up to the beginning.
Yes, I will. Sorry about that.
That's all right. We did as a PDF just because we know sometimes there's issues with not broadband, but bandwidth. So hopefully things will flow smoothly. As Tim introduced, my name is Heather Smeltz. I'm a civil engineer in the state office. I used to be in the field doing ag work, and I've since transitioned over to our watershed rehabilitation program, which does focus on our flood control dams. With that comes lots and lots of hydrology. So this is a fun subject for me to help talk to you about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to introduce himself and get us going.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Buckwater. I'm in the state office with Heather and Tim. We have a good group there, and we are always available at any point. I think Tim sent out the email with the PDF and has our contact information in there. I think we've CC'd. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. So yeah, I started out in the Western PA as an engineer in Somerset Tech Center and moved my way east where I grew up in Lancaster. So now I transitioned to Harrisburg, and it's a nice new challenge. With that, since it's early, I'm going to try to show a video. I don't know how this will work with people's bandwidth and things like that, but I think it's a good little intro. Let me try to share that. I wonder if I just got to share my desktop, really. Let me see. Anyone does?
We're still seeing the presentation, Mark.
Okay. It's not showing up as an op. Oh, here we go. Got it?
Yep, now we can see it.
All right. Brace yourself.
Since we're talking about water.
Yeah.
Is that a day on the job for Heather and Mark?
All right. How's that? Does that get people excited?
We can only wish, Tim. We can only wish.
So that's, there's a little bit of water put on the slide there, and obviously there's a lot of other engineering components with that, but maybe as a capstone, you guys can figure that out on your own, how much water and the friction of the plastic and things like that. So if everyone's awake, everyone has their coffee, we'll dive in, and I'll make this full screen. So the good part about this is we kind of put together a new presentation for this. We will have you guys for the whole the whole day in August, which is good. We'll dive into this a whole lot more than we are today. We just wanted to, the first bullet, understand the basics of hydrology, go through that a little bit, and just touch on some of the things this morning, and learn about, as conservationists, whatever your role is, hydrology plays a huge part. We'll understand the fundamentals of the hydrologic cycle. We'll learn about rainfall, return periods, and probabilities, touch a little bit on that. We'll identify factors that affect runoff. And if we have time, we'll open the EFH2 program and talk a little bit about making sure you guys can all have that loaded on your computers for August. And what's nice about this presentation is we're getting this a few months early. You're starting, the weather's good at spring, you're getting out in the field, you're seeing a lot of different things. Start thinking hydrology while you're out, and bring any questions or thoughts to our in-person meeting. So what is hydrology? It's the science that deals with the currents and behavior of water in the atmosphere. And it can be whether it's on the ground or underground. And we referenced the National Engineering Handbook, Part 630 on hydrology. So you could look that up and read more into this. That's where we're getting all of our points. That's where you can read about how the EFH2 program works and all the inputs and things like that. So in the broadest sense, hydrology deals with the computation of how much water we could expect. So what is hydrology? Study and characterization of water generated in a system. It can be characterized as in the quantity, the quality, or the flow rate, which is ultimately flow rate and runoff is what we're most interested in sizing practices. As mentioned before, it can be surface water or groundwater. What is hydrology not? Not study of weather or weather forecasting. So it's not meteorology. It's not what you necessarily see the forecast on the Weather Channel. And going beyond hydrology would be hydraulics, and it's not that either. That's a whole separate item. Once you know the flows you're dealing with, hydraulics is a study of the velocities, the flow, the depth of flow, and things like that. So what are some conservation practices where we deal with? Waterways, diversions, terraces, structures for water control, stream crossings, ponds, wetlands, dams and levees, and maybe you guys could even think of a few more. But through the next few slides, we're just gonna show some things we deal with as on a regular basis for Heather, Tim, and I as engineers, but I'm assuming you guys, whether you are designers, reviewers, just consultants. I think most of our roles were in a consulting role where we have customers that we present our knowledge to, and so there's aspects of that, and just get you guys thinking, what all hydrology plays in our regular work lives. And then also some of these pictures will show just the power of water and the force of once you have concentrated flow, what can happen and what kind of problems you can see. So I like to start with this slide. This picture shows concentrated flow we've seen through a crop field. Typical, water starts flowing, it starts running off the landscape, and you have this this water flow, and it's carrying the steeper slopes are carrying a little bit more velocity, and you're seeing soil and erosion come down and maybe settle out in some of the lower areas and just cause some good erosion. So what do we do with that? We often come in and do a conservation practice such as a waterway. Here's the picture on the left shows there was a slope coming down, and we put a manure pit, and I think this is a compost pad right here, if you can see my mouse. So there was a diversion into a waterway. So typical, often when you size practices to protect buildings or things, you size for a little bit higher rainfall event. But everyone's probably seen this. You put matting down on a waterway, get it stapled in good, and that'll carry and protect your flow, or protect your soil and grass. And Heather, any comments, please cut me off and fill in as you see. Here's a road on this upper picture with a road culvert. We'll often line that with rock to dissipate flow coming through that culvert. So we ultimately need to know the volume of water that culvert's gonna be taking to figure out then the hydraulics of the culvert to see what kind of how big a stone and then how big this apron should be. Here's a waterway after that same waterway down slope, has good grass, really good shape. And ultimately this waterway was sized for the volume of water we can expect coming off of the landscape for that particular area. It's not always perfect. Here's some. It could be engineering wise or the hydrology where the flow wasn't predicted right. Maybe the waterway was undersized or too big, or it could just be our inspector wasn't quite on the contract, or the contractor didn't tuck the fabric in. Maybe here was a seam and they didn't tuck in the next piece or get enough staples in. So this, we've definitely seen this, or maybe the rain event. We'll talk predicted rainfall and what we typically size these for, and maybe a rain came higher than we expected, and we didn't have enough protection to this waterway yet for it to withstand.
The other thing too, Mark, as
Yep.
I know you're getting to, but sometimes this often happens during waterway establishment when you don't have that grass cover to protect it, and you get more rain, or you do get a design storm that it wasn't quite ready to handle. So ultimately, these are failing because of hydrology and because of the water that they're seeing. We just don't know. There's not enough information at this point to know if it was poorly designed or if the hydrology just changed or came sooner than predicted.
Yep. Yeah, it's always tricky. Get these in and pray for nice gentle rains for the first month anyways. But that's definitely seen. I've seen that a few times in my career, and this was actually my site right here. They were rushing to get this in, and I was there late that day, but they had some more staples to do, and I don't think they quite put in enough. But all this flowed straight down, and this was a culvert taking it under some heavy use. I think this is a horse pasture, some heavy use areas here, and that carried the water under and came out. I think on Monday. This was over a weekend, and this is what we came out to. And there was a rock apron, and you can see a little bit of rock here, but it's pretty well silted in. Had a good contractor that really cleaned it up good, but just a headache for everyone. Here's another conservation practice. This would be a storage terrace that looks really good. So you'd have your area or watershed up above, sloping down, so you're getting your flow coming into this long spread out terrace, and then here's a riser pipe that slowly doses that water out.
Mark, can you just move your mouse over the berm so they can kind of see the shape of that?
Yep. So it's running along the contour yet, and we'll touch on some of these concepts a little more as we go on. But here's flow would come down and be held into this berm here along this side, and would back up based on how much water this little pipe decides to remove. So you're gaining some storage, some runoff storage here, and also just letting that water out slowly to protect the fields from erosion and protect often these are even in series, so you have a couple of these down the hill slope. So I think there were a couple above this one. And good inspection work. Get your route out there, get measurements, make sure things are getting put in right, which is some other subjects I think you guys cover this week. Here's another one. I think this was pushing its lifespan. You read some of our NRCS conservation practices, there is a lifespan even for a waterway or diversion, because you're assuming there will be some silting in, and it might not meet even new rainfall guidelines down the road. So here's, I don't know if the riser got plugged to here, but pretty significant. When this terrace built up and went over, this is where it went over the berm, and he's up to his knees in that erosion that happened. So we came in here and repaired these. So good pictures there. Here's a Dropbox. A lot of you guys will see this. You go to a farm and they'll have their gravel lane, and you start to see where some concentrated flow is washing some of the driveway. So you can come in here, strategically put in some drop boxes, and then see how size piping or how much water that surface inlet will ultimately be seeing. And then within this, you see there's a building here. Here was a new manure pit we built, so we wanted to protect that by putting gutters on this roof. And then you can see the downspout here, that all ran into the same drop box. So ultimately, these two pipes, you had to run hydrology to see how much water each of those pipes will take, and then ultimately size the last pipe for what all those pipes will bring in, plus surface water coming in there, and make sure things are sized appropriately. So typical thing you guys are going to see, typical drop box. You see those along highways, roads all the time to carry water away. Here's a site that here's underground flow. So we have a spring coming out. You can see the cattle. This was a terrible place to have hillscape coming in on the right side here, and cattle had access. I think their feed trough was below here, but this is where they went. Water continuously flowing right down. I think there's a road here down to a stream on the other side of the road. So with this site, we moved the cattle, built a new facility, actually captured this water, and put in a spring development down further. So this is completely changed. This is all grass now, part of the pasture, and this wet area is now captured and being able to be a water source for the cattle. So here's an option of some underground hydrology.
Even if that's not quite the main focus of today's talk, it's still good to see.
Yep.
Yeah.
Heather, do you want to talk on this one?
I can. So in front of you is a picture of something that's more common out west in the western part of the state. And I know it's happening a lot in West Virginia, but this is acid mine drainage treatment, or the formation of starting the treatment system. And Mark's going to scroll through a couple pictures in series of other different treatment options. But ultimately, when you're doing acid mine drainage, you need to know your hydrology and what's coming in to size and design your treatment system so you can appropriately and adequately plan to treat that flow. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're treating the concentrated low flow, and the higher flows are going to pass right through. But you have to establish that cutoff somewhere. And without knowing what your hydrology is and that water that's coming in, that doesn't happen. So in front of you, you can see the bypass channel for the treatment system, but you can also see some of it gets diverted into a wetland type system. And this carries over between with our wetland, our WRE projects and our WRP projects, as well as pond design. How do you size that wetland? How do you know how big it's going to be? How do you size the outlet features for it without knowing ultimately your hydrology coming in? So your hydrology is going to tie into almost everything that we do at some point in this agency. So go ahead,
Yep.
Mark, you can hit the next one.
Here's so cattle crossings, stream crossings, whether they're made out of slats in these two options here. You know, we want to get the cattle across. We want to protect the stream. We don't want, if it's a stable bottom, we'll have to think about that. But ultimately, we need to run a hydrology to see, you know, toe of bank, top of bank, what flows are coming through, and protect from those banks from erosion. And streams are one thing. I don't know if we touch on it too much today, but on our in-person, there's a program called Stream Stats that is very handy on when you're dealing with streams and potentially utilizing some runoff values from that website. But ultimately, we want to get the hydrology of the stream, what kind of flows, how wide are they gonna come out, and make sure those areas are protected. Two other things we are stream crossings, definitely a big one we're running into, and protecting our streams from livestock. Here's a typical one for Pennsylvania. You go out in the streams, you have eroded banks, you have higher flows that have maybe moved the stream. Maybe the landowner trying to straighten it, and now it wants to do its own thing, and has had these banks, undercut trees. So we'll often have to run hydrology to come in and size practices to repair that. This is the site after we left. We controlled the one bank, which had pretty good erosion, with riprap, and the riprap came up high enough so that actually it would flood on this other side. So there was no reason to take it too high, and then utilize these trees as long as they were alive to potentially maybe even repair themselves and still hold the bank. If they fall in, we're assuming that it's high enough that I wouldn't rip out some of the riprap. And here are stream barbs with rock to try to keep that stream from coming over. I'm getting into a lot of the design aspects, but really we're focusing on getting the water and what's coming through here. This was a good one here. Shows this was an emergency watershed protection project that we had. NRCS will come out after big flood events, and you can see just the force of water. This was a storm event in 2018, 2019. And it got up to this bridge, and you can see from this picture here, it buckled the bridge. That's how fast water was coming as it hit this bridge deck and flowed on the left side here, and it just, the force it had, and it just buckle this pavement. Ultimately, it flowed down here, got in behind this precast wall, and pushed that in. This was also very sketchy. This ended up falling in by the time we even started construction. But I was the engineer on this and ran flows coming down this stream. And this is a little bit showing the repair we did. This is where that undercut area was. Put in some rock there to stabilize that bank. Repaired some blocks that fell in. Put in this hardscape in order to make sure the flow couldn't get behind this wall again. And did some riprap downstream. Heather, I'll give you the last two pictures.
Yeah, these are from the dam world. These are from our watershed dams. So the top left picture is basically just showing the riser of one of our dams out in Bucks County. That controls the normal flow and controls the normal pool. And that flood pool that you see, or the normal water level that you see behind it. And the picture on the right is just outflow through one of the principal spillway pipes. And the flow down on the left, or the picture down the left, is higher flood flow through an impact basin. And one thing to point out is when you're working with flood control dams, or dams in general, the different levels of intakes either on the riser or on the auxiliary spillway, which takes flow around the dam if the water level gets too high, are set based on your 100-year storm event, your maximum peak flow. So your hydrology becomes critically important because it designs it and sets those elevations of those features of the dam. Mark, if you want to go to the next picture, the next slide, please.
Yep.
This is from 2006. In June, we had some big storms in 2006, which caused some EWP work, very similar to what Mark was showing from the 2018 storms. And this was flow through the auxiliary spillway of one of our dams in Monroe County. It's just the power of water is amazing. And the rate and the amount that comes through, this dam had not flown before. And to flow now, you can see in the picture of the right, once the water stopped, this is against the far right side of that auxiliary spillway, and you can see the erosion that it caused just by that power of water. One thing to point out is you're going to hear, or you've probably heard H&H a lot, the term H&H, which is hydrology and hydraulics. Hydrology, which we're talking about today, is how much water and how do you characterize the water that's coming to your spot. The hydraulic part is how does that water move through your spot and the engineering behind it. So you'll often hear both of them together, but ultimately everything starts with the hydrology. So with that, Mark, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That was good recap there. Yeah, so with all these pictures, we just wanted to get you guys toes dipped a little bit this morning. What we're going to touch on the rest of this afternoon, just some of the topics and justify or go about how we're going to come up with some of these rates and how we look at an area to get the amount of runoff and what we're sizing these practices we just touched on for. So with that, we'll dive into the second half, it looks like. The types of hydrology, we touched on that. It's groundwater or surface. Today, we're focused on surface water hydrology and the prediction of flow volumes, prediction of flow rates at a given point of interest, and the prediction of timing of flow. So, where in our watershed, if we're higher, if we're lower, at what point is that water going to get, how fast, and how much. So we'll get into those topics. Here's the outline of what we really follow in August when we get together. These are the concepts, items in order to run the computer program EFH2. You'll have rainfall. Heather will talk about these a little later, watershed size and topography, and we'll also touch on this runoff curve number, which includes these four topics: hydrologic soil group, cover type treatments, and hydrologic conditions. So the perfect place to start is always with rainfall, the hydraulic cycle. So how's water coming on our landscape and things like that. So it's a different process in the cycle. You'll have precipitation, you'll have losses through abstraction or evaporation, and then transformation would be any water that's not absorbed or abstracted is going to end up being runoff, and what we're ultimately trying to determine. Maybe most of you in your careers or schooling have seen the hydrologic cycle or a map like this, where it's showing precipitation hits the surface. You have some infiltration. You'll have some surface runoff. You'll have some hitting the groundwater, flowing in the streams or rivers or ponds or the ocean. You have the evaporation and just the cycle of clouds absorbing the evaporation and then raining again, and then just how all these components interact and how can we as determine the hydrology based on all these factors. Here's another resemblance of that same thing, showing kind of the runoff process within the hydrologic cycle. Just showing a little bit more, okay, here's land surface you have vegetation typically on the land surface and what impact that has. What land, some will go infiltrate into the soil, some will, capillary rise if it's picking up by some of the vegetation, some will go straight into groundwater, and ultimately your discharge is always the stream or water body leaving, but ultimately we can go upstream if we're doing a waterway. Okay, we need that water at this point. So here's another good map for you guys to visualize things. Here's precipitation. It can be rainfall, snow, hail, or sleet. A lot of people are familiar with this type of rain gauge. You guys will have this at your homes or in your backyards. There's typically official rainfall data. We'll use a gauge like this on the right here, typically to measure in inches of rainfall.
And Mark, if you can go back to that one real quick. So inside that'll have a little tipping bucket and a clicker that counts how often you get so much, if it's a teaspoon that fills that bucket, but it correlates back to a depth of rainfall. And as it tips, it records. So you know the intensity of that rainfall, how fast it was coming through as well for those automated systems. They're really cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks, Heather.
Yep.
Wanted to throw this map in there. This is I couldn't find a newer one. This is a really good map that's just from period of 1961 to 1990 for average annual rainfall in Pennsylvania. This is a good map to show you guys, as you guys are all spread out in different counties in the states. You can kind of see where you're at and match up the color on how much average rainfall you guys have. And there's different pockets that are above and higher, and we'll touch more into this and our day together and how the computer program, which is nice. We'll cover some rainfall and touch on some things that might be over your head, and sometimes I feel like they're a little over my head, but the program does it for you. You ultimately need to know what county you're in and what rainfall data you should use in the program, but it's really today is just to cover these concepts a little bit with you guys. And this map does a good job of showing, and I think it's pretty relevant because even the data we cover has these areas as different rainfall distributions. Moving on. So sources of precipitation data. So where do we get all this information? It's easy enough for us to just go on a website or use the program. So where is all this coming from? And there's agencies that do this work and input this data through these rainfall gauges. NWS would be the National Weather Service, the NOAA, which I don't know, it's primarily what we use as engineers. I don't know if some of you have heard of that term. That would be the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they do a lot of these inputs. Other local agencies and other entities. There's some radar-based hydrology, which would be the Doppler, and there's some other ways to quantify those runoff or those rainfall distributions. And then you have design storms derived from rain gauge data, and there'll be your hypothetical events, the 10-year, 25-year, 100-year precipitations. I'm assuming most of you have heard those terms. Hey, we got a 100-year storm, or we're sizing this practice for a 10-year or 25-year storm event. We'll touch on how they come about and what they mean. And please think of questions or any questions you have. We'll probably have some time in the end, or jot them down for the next time we're together. So sources of precipitation data. There's two important aspects of precipitation: total depth of rainfall and time and spatial distribution of this rainfall. So the time and spatial distribution, the program covers that. It's like your hydrograph, which is another term we'll talk about later. that shows how the water is coming in. Usually you have a slow start to a rainfall that soaks things up, then you have a peak, then it kind of levels off. So, and you can have different ones of those in different areas. And so that's accounted for in the program, and then ultimately how much rain we have within that span in that storm event. Rainfall intensity and peak flow. So ultimately, within a rain event, you have a rainfall intensity, the rate at which a given depth of rain occurs. How fast is that coming? And typically that's in inches per hour units. Peak flow, the highest flow rate during a given precipitation event at a certain location within the watershed. So this is what EFH2, the program, what we're covering today, what we ultimately want to know and want to size practices for is that peak flow, that amount of runoff that is coming to our spot. Okay, so return period and probability. So getting into that 100-year, 50-year. So a return period is the expected occurrence of an event that meets or exceeds the specified time and the corresponding discharge Q, where Q is the number a year period. So the amount of runoff coming off in whatever year period you're saying. So what do those years mean? It's a probability. It's the decimal probability of an occurrence in a given year. It is the inverse. So a 100-year storm is not something that will happen every 100 years. If any of you thought that, and a 10-year isn't. It's going to happen once within 10 years. It's the probability of happening. You could have a 100-year storm every year. It's basically 1 over 100, which would be 1% probability. 10-year would be 10%. 25-year would be a 4% probability of happening in a given year. And these probability is unchanged year to year, as I mentioned. You can have these. You start the next year, the probability of 100-year storm happening again is the same. So where can we get some of this information? I mentioned NOAA before. This is their website. It's been down. Heather said, we were talking about this yesterday, that they actually had a storm come through, and maybe some of they're having issues anyways.
The basement got flooded, to my understanding.
Hey, we're talking hydrology, right?
Yeah, kind of ironic.
So we would, as eastern part of this, or Pennsylvania, we would use this website, and then some of the Western U.S. folks would use this link. And once we can get into the website, it's very. This is a snippet of it. They have rainfall gauges scattered around the state, as per we mentioned before. So you might pick an area, and it might show, it will reference data from a few miles away based on what's the closest data for the site you're picking. And then from there, you can get these tables that has your duration and your yearly interval. So if we're looking at a 10-year storm over 24 hours, your total inches of runoff would be, or total inches of rainfall would be 3.9. So this is used. These are all already input into the program that we will be running, that we'll be teaching on when we're together. But good reference, and you can ultimately go into these and reference your area and sub out some of these values into the program. But we're not asking you guys to do that at this point. It's just if you were working with something you wanted a little more input or something on. So that covers a lot of the rainfall. This is, again, there's multiple hydrologic cycles out there, and this is one we really like. It's conservation oriented, and so I wanted to point this out to transition into, okay, now we're talking, okay, we got the rain, we know some's going to absorb, some's going to run off into our streams and lakes, but now let's looking at this, you can really look at the landscape and see, okay, cover, what kind of aspect is a grass lawn going to have versus something planted in corn or hay or something that's woods? How is what's on the soil ultimately going to impact how water runs off or water infiltrates and things like that? And here's other things we push. We push contour farming. We push terraces. We push farming on the contour. We push no-till. All of these should be concepts, even though you're in the beginning of your careers, maybe these should be concepts you've heard and know about. And those are all things that we're going to touch on next. Okay, they all have good impacts on how much water runs off in the end. And then we'll touch a little bit on soils. I think you guys had some talks with Yuri on some soil aspects. So that ultimately has a very big effect too on how much that soil is even able to absorb and infiltrate and how quickly. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the first bullet here for factors affecting surface runoff. The main factors affecting the volume of rainfall that runs off are the kind of soil and the type of vegetation on the watershed. So this mainly affects the volume. And then Heather will touch on this lower point after I discuss these topics. So during a given rainfall, you'll have abstractions and losses. That's where precipitation does not become direct runoff. So the amount of water that infiltrates or percolates into the soil. So if you have some of these depressed area, ultimately this has a little bit of a storage volume, and this amount of water, once filled up, will stay here in your watershed and not run off. Snow ultimately won't run off right away. It's typically not good when you get a heavy rain on top of, on a warmer day that has snow, you'll have a little bit extra of runoff. And then what is evaporation or transpired through the plants? Were you going to say something, Heather?
Yeah, I want to jump in real quick for that snow.
Yep.
Since we're on the East Coast, we don't generally design for snow. If you're on the West Coast or further west where snowpack provides a bunch of your hydrology and maybe most of your hydrology, that's a totally different design, totally different calculation. So it's more just what I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Thanks, Mark.
Yep, that's good. Went a little too far. So back to our main slide here. Talked a little bit about rainfall. Now I'm going to talk about the runoff curve number a little bit, which takes into account how much water is going to infiltrate and be absorbed by the land, and how much would run off based on the rainfall and distribution that's coming down with that rain event. So the runoff curve number is an index of the amount of runoff from a watershed. It is a value from 0 to 100, and the practical applications are the curve number of 40 to 98. The higher the curve number, the higher the runoff. And it is not necessarily a percentage of the rainfall that becomes runoff. It's the curve number that weighs a lot of these different factors. And 100% or 100 would be equal to total runoff. And actually the highest in the chart goes up to 98, thinking that some absorbs within that little bit. So there's these 3, 4 things with the hydraulic condition take into effect to ultimately determine your runoff curve number. The hydraulic soil group, hydrologic soil group, it's a group of soils having the same runoff potential. And I'll touch in the next slide on where to get that. I don't know that Yuri would cover necessarily this part of soils, but with her talks, you can probably visualize what they mean and how they are accounted for. The land cover, so what's on the land, whether it's corn, beans, woods, pasture, and then land treatment and the hydrologic condition. plays an effect. So the first question I wanted to ask, Tim, if you're on.
Oh yeah, I'm here.
Would be, so this is, I didn't cover it, so this will be a good kind of gauge where you're at and maybe, and just see and something to discuss on. So it'd be question number 2, and it would be soils classified as hydrologic soil group A have what runoff potential?
Okay, I put that in the chat, and if you don't mind, I'll steal the presentation to show answers that are coming in, if that's okay, Mark.
Absolutely.
Okay. See, can you see the question?
Yep.
And no responses yet. Here we go.
So no pressure. This is not one we'd expect you to know, but you could maybe do an educated guess.
Hey, Tim, we're seeing errors in the chat box that's not loading. Or the link is bad.
The link is bad. It's working for some people. Let's try it again. Thanks, Heather.
Yep.
And if it's not loading, try the refresh. I don't know if MS Forms is bogged down at the moment, but I had to hit refresh a couple times to get into the question this morning. Got 5 responses so far, and pretty consistently the same answer. And if you have trouble with it loading on MS Forms, just give an answer in the chat.
Heather, I might be a little long-winded here. We only had 12 minutes.
You're fine on time. That's no problem.
All right.
Oh, no one else has anything else to do today except listen to us, Mark.
Right.
Jim
And Jim
doesn't need
Gillis.
any time.
And we're getting a lot of good answers in the chat there too, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, so you probably have, if you had an educated guess, it's either probably A or D. So one would be high or one would be, one's the middle would be the B, A, B, C, or D. And that's one thing I wanted to mention before I asked the question. They range from A to D. So A, B, C, or D. So A is actually the lowest runoff potential. I think that was the consensus. So that's typically your sandy soils, your gravel soils. It's going to have a lot more infiltration and water capacity before water would run off. And subsequently, D would be more your clays, and you'd see a lot more runoff potential in those areas. Let me share again. And you can have some combined situations, which we'll talk about later. Quick touch on where's the easiest and best place to get this information. It would be Web Soil Survey. That's a website run by the USDA, I think specifically NRCS. And that would be the most up-to-date place to go to get your hydrologic soil group and get that runoff potential. We'll keep moving a matter of time. After you got your soils, that's probably the easiest part in your watershed. Next is the land cover, the treatment, and hydrologic condition. So here's some different examples of what you can see on especially farms and what they have on the landscape. So here's corn, here's some wheat or barley, here's some you don't see on a farm really. It's a city, but urban and impervious area such as roads or driveways or parking lots, things like that. Here's alfalfa and here's some pasture. So we'll throw it to another quick question on that. Would be question 3, Tim. Which I'll let you pull up it and then I can read it.
Okay, give me a second. And the land cover question?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
And here it is. I'll put that in the chat. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So the question reads: which one of the following land cover descriptions produces the larger volume of runoff from a significant rainstorm, assuming all are on the same hydrologic soil group and have the same hydrologic condition? So of those, picture those in your mind on what the cover would look like and how you think they would influence how much water would run off.
And I think the forms was just slow. We ended up getting 30 some answers on the first question. It just took a while for it to come in. But go ahead
Okay.
and answer there or in the chat.
Yep.
That's fine. And then I had one person email me saying that the chat wasn't working for them. So if you have that problem, just shoot me an email and that's fine. That was where our issue started yesterday, though, before Teams crashed. So hopefully that's not foreshadowing, but we'll see.
Okay.
As long as we can finish and it crashes on Jim. I saw he just joined, so I can pick on him a little bit.
If there's anybody it should crash on, I guess it's me.
If there's anybody it will crash on, it's Jim. I sit next to Jim at the office, and I've heard his struggles with meetings.
Yes, the computer is not my friend sometimes.
So I'm not getting any answers in the chat or in MS Forms. So okay, and
Not opening.
if you folks want to just answer in the chat, then that's fine. Oh,
So yeah, so it looks
we
like
do have 13.
Yep, there's a few coming in. We'll just do the answer, assuming a lot of things, assuming your same soil, same condition. If you look through the charts, ultimately row crops would have the most runoff potential. And if you kind of picture that, you have a lot of bare areas between each row crop. So you're going to have, and we push cover, we push no-till, yes, and we push cover crops. Yes, that's what I'm thinking of. So we push that things for a reason, to make sure we have cover over most of the landscape. So row crop would have that bare areas, would ultimately lead to a little more runoff.
It also has less vegetation on it, so there's less evaporation going on, or infiltration up through evapotranspiration. So now I can't talk either, Mark. But
All right.
so there's less air or pockets potentially available in that soil to infiltrate water compared to the other land covers.
Yep. And I'll just go through these last two pictures because we'll cover this really in depth. But you can think, all right, the last few are the hydrologic condition and things like the treatment. So conservation. So if there's crop residue on, if they're plowing it and tilling it, those have a big impact as well. So here's where you have terraces. So you're having many little storage terraces. That also has a big effect on what your ultimate cumulative curve number runoff would be. So you're storing more runoff. You're storing, in each one of these little terraces, diversions. So ultimately that water is going to absorb it there before it would come down the hill to maybe where you're planning another practice. With that, I'll pass it on to Heather. Wrap up at the end.
Thanks, Mark. And we are flying through some of this technical material with you only being with us for an hour. We just want to give you an overview to it. We'll definitely dive into all of this a lot more when we're in person in August. But Mark talked about the factors that affect the volume of rainfall, and I'm going to touch on those that affect the rate, which include the topography and conservation practices, as well as the shape of your watershed. So Mark, if you can move to the next slide, please. So when we talk about watershed, we talk about the physical land area that contributes water in the form of runoff to your point of interest. And that red boundary on the map is a watershed boundary, or what we're calling our watershed boundary. So everything that lands inside that boundary will go past our point of interest. Every drop of rain that lands outside the boundary will go outside of our watershed. Go ahead. And we get all this, we figure this out using topographic maps. And what topographic maps basically do is they take a three-dimensional figure like that in front of you, and they make it a two-dimensional figure. So if you could go to the next slide. So one of the things I like to do, if you're kind of looking at me, if you're watching my picture, is it takes a three-dimensional crumpled up piece of paper, and it shows what this elevation of everything looks like, completely spread out on a flat two-dimensional surface. And if you can move to the next slide. We talked a little bit about the watershed boundary already, and it's that divide between one watershed and another where all your water will come to your point versus going somewhere else. There's various ways of delineating this and figuring it out. We can do it by hand, which is how we will teach you in August. You can also use GIS technologies. Mark had mentioned StreamStat previously. There's AutoCAD technologies that can do it for you. My only words of advice for those are trust but verify, which is why we teach you how to do it by hand, because you need to know what you're looking at to know if it's giving you good results. I've had some, especially using StreamStat, where I set it to map my watershed and it mapped totally downstream of the watershed and didn't give me anything upstream. So we just need to be a little bit careful with that. Tim, at this point, I was going to ask my question 1A, but I'm going to skip it just to keep us moving a little bit.
Sure, that's fine.
So, and Mark, if you want to go back, go forward one slide, please. You're too quick on the clicker.
Yeah, my wheel.
Yeah, so when you're looking at a topographic map, one of the key features on the map is contour lines, which are those brownish lines that you see, and they represent lines of equal elevation. So everywhere around that line is the exact same elevation on that line, everywhere on the physical landscape. And contours reference a height above sea level. They come in different intervals. The latest LiDAR that we have is 2-foot intervals. Some counties have 5-foot. The USGS maps, like you have in front of you, are often in 20-foot or 10-foot intervals. And the shape of those contours and how they fall on the landscape represent different slopes and control the flow paths and the hydraulic travel time through the watershed, which ultimately affects our time of concentration. So if you want to move to the next slide, please. Our topography in that watershed, which comes back to our slopes and our flow lengths, is best defined by that slope, and it controls where and how fast the water flows. So as your slope and your average slope in the watershed increases, your discharge rate, or how fast that water moves off the landscape, is also going to increase. So if you think about it, if you're a sledder or a skier, the steeper the slope that you're going down, the faster you move, the more the whee kind of factor that goes in. And it's the same thing in your watershed. The steeper the slope, the faster the water travels. It takes a path of least resistance. And then your flow length is basically how far does the water have to travel through that watershed to get out. And it's assuming that all the rain that comes down is the same intensity and the same amount over the entire watershed. So basically, a longer watershed length means that the peak areas from the rest of the watershed have time to get out before that furthest contributing part gets out and before it all hits. So another way to think about it is if you go to a concert or a football game, you know how they're normally an oval-shaped stadium that you're going into. When that concert or that football game is over, pretend that there's only one entrance and one exit. If you have one exit at the side of that stadium, not at the end, but on one of the fat sides of the stadium of that oval, there's going to be a bigger hang-up of people, of that mad rush of people trying to get out at that door on the side, because it's a shorter flow path for people to walk through than if that door is at the far end, and more people have a chance to get out before the people all the way in the back of the stadium are able to get there just because of the way it's shaped. So that's something to think about as you're working through your length and your discharge rate. If you want to move to the next slide. Mark touched a little bit on some of the conservation practices, but the conservation practices that are often in the field do have a big effect on your topography. And while they don't necessarily affect slope, they can affect your flow length. So by adding in diversions in waterways, they can both, or terraces and things along those lines, they can divert more water either into or out of your watershed. So that will affect your overall watershed size and your hydrology, but they can also affect your flow path, that longest flow path that the water has to take to get to its outlet. So by adding in conservation practices strategically within your watershed, you can actually slow down your rates a little bit by using those conservation practices. So if you want to move to the next one, please. So we talked about this, but I wanted to put some terms to it. You've heard us mention runoff and you've heard us mention discharge or that peak flows. When you're writing or you're working out equations, you often will see runoff, that volume expressed in a term of V, the letter V. And it's the excess water that runs or leaves the drainage area minus the initial abstractions and losses. And it's a volume. Generally, it's expressed as acre inches, but that acre inches can then be converted to gallons or cubic feet, depending on what you're doing. The other term for hydrology that we often talk about is a Q, or the discharge, or the peak discharge. So you'll often see that as Q with a subscript P behind it, QP. And that's how fast does that water move off. It's generally in terms of cubic feet per second, which could also be converted to gallons per minute. So Mark, if you want to go to the next slide. Those V and Q terms are generally what we reference when we take our hydrology into the hydraulic world and go and try and determine the size and type of conservation practices on the landscape. And the size and scale of those will determine what we're doing if we're sizing something fairly small, such as the small check dam in front of you in the bottom left, or if we're looking at something a lot larger. And all that then relates back to your job approval authority, which you'll be hearing about throughout this week, as well as when we see you in person. So I have one last slide, which is talking about some of the other references for the National Engineering Handbook, Part 630 and Part 650. 630 is everything you ever want to know about hydrology, and it's a source document for all the methods that NRCS uses. Part 650, specifically the Engineering Field Handbook, is what we generally use when we're in the field to work through and size our hydrology. And this is what EFH2 is based off of. Now, there are other ways to calculate your hydrology. There's other models out there. We've mentioned StreamStats, which is based on regression equations. There's rationale method. We also have other programs such as TR20 and WinTR55, which are for larger scale watershed size models. If you're not familiar with the NRCS tools, maybe you're familiar with the Army Corps tools such as HEC HMS. But ultimately for this training and what we use most of the time in our agency is EFH2. So you're going to want to make sure that that program is loaded on your computer prior to us having our training in August. And I will be sending out an email as a follow-up to this training to make sure that if you don't already have it loaded, you know where to go to get it. And I think our last slide is just simply for questions. And we are going to skip the demo of EFH2, and we'll just cover all that since we're going to hit it hard in August. So thank you.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know we'll be able to go to a site in August and walk and see some things, maybe walk a little bit of the watershed and see what kind of landscape and how all the cover affects the hydrology. But if you want to unmute and ask questions for a little bit, we can.
We just covered it all perfectly. No one has any questions. It was so crystal clear.
Right.
I don't see any questions in the chat either, Mark or Heather. So big thanks to both of you. We certainly appreciate it. And folks, if you think of anything in the meantime, let us know and we can reach out to Mark or Heather. But you'll see them a lot come August time. And when you're out there and it's raining, big next rainstorm, take a look and see what the water's doing. I think that's a ton of fun. I love that. Now I guess I'm biased, but I just think that's so much fun to see some of our conservation practices working. So thank you, Heather and Mark. Now, Jim, with that, there was one person that was having trouble with the chat, and I hope that's not foreshadowing. That was the first issue that started yesterday before Teams crashed on us. But if Teams does crash, just go back to the link and everyone can get back into the meeting. That worked out fine yesterday, but hopefully we won't have that issue. I do want to give a 10-minute break though, so that one person has the opportunity to go out of the meeting and come back in, and that'll allow me to fill my coffee cup back up too. So we'll take a 10-minute break right now, and then we'll roll into our next presentation, and we'll get you out by lunchtime today. That's our goal. So we got lots of time. Thank you very much. I will share a countdown clock, and we will take our 10-minute break. All right, hopefully everyone is back from their little break. I appreciate everyone's participating, and I did get one more email from someone, so there are two people that are having issues with the chat. I apologize about that, and during break I was trying to look up what the issues might be for MS Teams, and it sounds like it's just a glitch when you have a reoccurring meeting, and sometimes the chat stops working for some people, so I apologize about that. If you have issues with the chat, just shoot me an email, let me know that you're here today, and we'll make sure you get marked as participating. With that, our next presentation comes from Jim Gillis. Jim Gillis is our Pennsylvania NRCS state biologist, and he's going to start his talk by talking about fish and wildlife. So, Jim, with that, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you, Jim.
All right, now the next question is, can you see my screen?
No, we can't see your screen, though.
Okay, let me try to figure this one out.
So after you hit the box with the arrow, I don't know, did you select your screen or a specific document?
I have a specific document.
Okay.
So let me try again. Are you seeing it now?
No, not yet.
Okay. All right, so let me do this again.
And I can always share your presentation if we need to.
Yeah, why don't we do it that way, because it doesn't seem to want to be opening.
Sure, no problem.
So I'm gonna go back. I am no longer sharing, so you should be able to pull it up. Yep, all right, that's what we're looking for.
Okay, let me jump to. Okay.
Okay. So of course, what we're taught, as Tim just mentioned, what we're going to be talking about for my session is fish and wildlife resources in the agricultural setting. Tim, if you could advance it, please. So our objectives for this morning, there are three. The first one is we need to understand why fish and wildlife resource concerns are considered during conservation planning. We need to understand the resource concerns that are important to wildlife. And we need to begin to view the agricultural landscape as an interaction of many different systems. And those systems can complement each other and serve multiple purposes. And the main point behind this is that folks need to realize that it's not an either or situation, in the sense that, you know, you can either have agriculture or wildlife, but you can't have both. That is not correct. And that's one of the things that we want to drive home today, is that you can have both in the same location without being a detriment to either one of them. Next slide, please. So when it comes to wildlife resource concerns, you know, everyone pretty much acknowledges that wildlife has value, excuse me, but that the value that's assigned to it varies depending on the person's viewpoint. Excuse me, one moment. Okay. So, for example, someone who's a bird watcher and maybe owns some, you know, a smaller piece of property or a forested piece of property, they might view wildlife as more important than a row crop farmer who tends to think of wildlife in terms of deer or groundhogs, and you know, views them as more of a detriment than a positive on their property. There are lots of different wildlife species. Obviously, the pictures here, you know, we've got pheasants, elk, turkeys, frogs, owls, you know, hawks, and in many cases, the game species tend to get more attention. They tend to be more popular for hunting purposes, obviously. And the other species like the frog, the owls, the hawks, either have little or no attention paid to them, or maybe even negative attention in the case of the hawks and other predators. But our role is to consider all of them, whether they're popular or not. And one of the main questions I often get is, well, should we even be considering wildlife on a farm if it's not one of the farmer's objectives? So if the farmer doesn't say to us, you know, I would like to manage for wildlife, do we really have to consider it? Next slide. And the answer to that is a resounding yes. We have to consider wildlife in every situation that we work in because it's a public resource. It falls under the same category as water, as air, and then of course, you know, it's right there with fish and wildlife. And why is that? Why is it considered a public resource? And to understand that, you have to go back pretty far back in our history in North America. Next slide, please. And the reason for this is that, you know, in Europe, before the US was settled, the land, the crops, the livestock, even the trees and the animals, the wild game, were property of the landowner. And you have to realize that there weren't that many landowners. And the ones who were you know, sort of from the aristocratic class. They were barons, they were lords, they were all of these different, you know, higher levels of society. The average person did not own land. So therefore, the crops, the livestock, the trees, and even the wild game were not available to them. If they were hunting game to feed their families, they were essentially poaching, as you know, as far as the law was concerned. And unauthorized use of any of those items was actually a punishable crime. So for the peasants or the serfs or the average person, none of these things were available to them without penalty. So when America was settled, they deliberately changed those rules. And the land, the vegetation, and the domestic animals are private property, but fish and wildlife are considered public property. And we see this even today because the fish and wildlife populations are managed by state agencies. They're not managed by individuals. You know, they're not managed by people who have a certain goal for their property or something like that. And that's why we see different hunting seasons and different regulatory laws established regarding wildlife, because they are considered a public resource. Next slide. So because they're a public resource, we have laws, both national and state, that oversee fish and wildlife as that public resource. And just like any other federal and state laws, NRCS has to consider those laws at all times. So even though it may not be the cooperator's choice or the farmer's choice, you know, they quite honestly may not care about wildlife on their property, but we still have to. We are required to by laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. All of these things should be pretty familiar to us, and they all result in the fact that we have to consider wildlife and its habitat. Next slide. So where this sometimes comes into conflict is that the landowners and the laws related to wildlife may not have the same objective. And to put this in terms that are a little bit more familiar to us, the same applies to water quality issues and laws as well. For example, we'll sometimes hear a landowner say, well, you know, I need to spread my manure in the winter because my pit is full. Well, the law says that spreading manure can only be done in certain ways to protect water quality because of the public benefits related to clean surface water. So there you have this conflict between what the landowner wants to do and what the law says they can do. And now a more wildlife or habitat oriented example would be a landowner saying that they want to drain a wetland because they want more acres to crop or because they need more acres to graze their cattle, things like that. That's actually a very common situation. The law, though, would say that some of those actions aren't allowed because the public resource of water quality or habitat or wildlife provides similar public benefits and therefore are protected at the public or state level. Next slide. So just a quick summary here. We do have to consider wildlife because it is considered that public resource. Just like water quality, just like air quality, we have to throw wildlife and habitat in that same mix. Next slide. So, the next question is, well, what do we consider farmland wildlife? If we have to consider wildlife, then really what wildlife should we be considering? And farmland wildlife is generally considered any sort of wildlife species that would live in open or non-forested areas. And unfortunately, some of the fastest declining wildlife populations occur in these open areas. And one example is, grassland birds. And there's a couple examples here on the screen. The barn owl, which is second from the left, and the bluebird, which is third from the right, and then the northern harrier hawk, which is on the far right. All of those require grasslands or shorter habitats to forage in, to hunt for food. Well, those groups have had about a 60% decline over the last 40 years. So if you think about that, that's more than half of their populations in every case, which is a lot of people are like, oh, it's birds, it doesn't really matter. But imagine how we would react if there was a 60% decline in farm acres over the last 40 years. That would get our attention very, very quickly. And one of the reasons why we should be paying attention to declines like this is that it kind of comes back to the canary in a coal mine situation, where these species are actually really good indicators of the overall health and the overall success of our landscapes. So if there aren't enough insects, or if there aren't enough mammals, small mammals and things like that, for these species to continue to exist on open farmland, then that shows an underlying problem that things are a little bit out of whack. That maybe we're doing something that is going to have bigger ramifications than what we know, and that we're so focused on producing more crops that we maybe don't realize that there are trickle-down effects that are resulting from that. Next slide, please. So, when we ask the question, well, why is that farmland wildlife declining? There are generally two groups or categories of answers that come up. Some of them are natural and things that we would say occur, no matter what in the landscape, and some of them are unnatural. And typically these unnatural ones come from some sort of a human cause. And the natural ones tend to get a lot more attention from private landowners versus the unnatural ones. And that's just human nature, because it's easier to point out something that's not our fault, for lack of a better way to put it, versus one of these unnatural causes, which really is, brought about by humans. So I want to deal with the natural ones first, and then we'll move into unnatural. Tim, can you advance it one, please? So predators are one of the natural causes of population decline. And this one often gets blamed a lot. And unfortunately, we even have a name for it, and we tend to refer to it as the hawks and foxes kind of syndrome, where if you ask someone why there's no more pheasants or bobwhite on their farm, they will very quickly tell you that it's because the hawks are eating them all. However, if you stop to think about it, those predator-prey relationships are as old as the animals themselves. It's not like hawks have suddenly decided that they want to eat bobwhite. Hawks have been eating bobwhite for hundreds of years, and they manage typically to stay in pretty good balance with one another. What you won't find is hawks or foxes eating all of the prey in the area that they cover, simply because first, they can't catch them all. They're just not that efficient. And second, if they were to eat all of the prey at once, they're going to starve. There won't be any food left for them. So they don't. And that's not a conscious decision on their part. It's just sort of a fact of nature. And the other thing is that, predation is normal. It's not an unnatural thing. It's not something that is artificial or has never occurred before. It's always been there. It's always been a part of the natural ecosystems. And as a result, it doesn't cause a massive decline unless something else is wrong in the landscape. For example, there's something that makes the prey more vulnerable, or makes the predators more efficient. So those are two things we'll discuss a little later on. And the final thing that we need to consider is that these predator species are wildlife too. When we talk about having to consider wildlife, we're not just talking about deer and rabbits and turkeys. We're talking about all wildlife. So the hawks and the owls, and as well as some of these smaller prey species, they deserve our attention too. It's not a popularity contest. If they're a wildlife species, we have to consider them in our work. Next slide. So the next natural one that gets a lot of discussion is diseases. And it's anything from rabies. I hear about avian flu fairly often. It can be any of those. West Nile virus is a recent one. But really, these diseases have a lot less effect on wildlife than most people think. And there's two main reasons for that. Unlike domestic animals, which is kind of what most people think wildlife is like, unlike those domestic animals, wildlife has more natural tolerance or immunity. They're just tougher. They can survive more things because they spend every day out in the wild fending for themselves. By their very nature, they're really resilient, and they're used to some of these hardships. Compared to domestic animals, which typically don't have to forage for their food, they don't have to find shelter every day, they don't have to avoid predators and all of those things. So, animal per animal, wildlife is just more resilient and, like I said, tougher than domestic animals, and therefore they're not as susceptible to these diseases. They've built up more immunity and more tolerance. And the other thing is that unlike domestic animals, most wildlife doesn't occur in dense groups. They tend to be in small family groups, or maybe a small group of 5 to 10 individuals or something like that. But in many cases, they're almost considered a lone animal for most of their year and most of their lives. And because they're so separated physically, there's less transmission. And of course, one of the best comparisons that we can make right now is the idea of social distancing. Well, wildlife social distance on their own, and they've done it for generations. So they already do what we've had to do for the last year, and for the same reason, with the same results. They just don't transmit these diseases the way domestic animals would, because they're not crammed into the same small spaces that we do with domestic animals. Next slide. So that kicks us over into the unnatural causes. And one that gets a lot of press is pesticides. And, it's easy, and sometimes it's popular, to blame pesticides and say that that's the reason that wildlife populations are declining. But in reality, any harm that pesticides cause are usually an indirect effect of the chemical. So it'll kill the plants or insects in the fields, which is exactly what it's meant to do. But it's not going to kill the animals if they're directly exposed. So, for example, there have been studies done, and I actually helped with a couple of these, where there were bobwhite chicks out in a field when someone was spraying an herbicide over the field. And yes, the animals did get sprayed, but because of their feathers or because of their fur, they didn't really absorb that much of the spray. And the spray is diluted enough at that point that it doesn't really harm them. It may not be great for them, but it's not going to kill them in and of itself. But it is going to kill the plants that they might be relying on for seed sources. It's going to kill the insects that they're definitely relying on seed sources. So it has this indirect effect of reducing their food base, essentially. And when there's no food, they have to leave and go somewhere else to find that food. The other way that it can affect them physically is that it can absorb into the plants or insects and then eventually transfer up through the food chain to other animals that would eat that affected pest. And probably the best known example of this is the effect of DDT on bald eagles. Now, of course, people weren't spraying the eagles with DDT, but what happened was they were spraying their fields and their crops with DDT. it would wash off of the fields in sediment and it would transfer to surface waters where it would be absorbed by the fish. And then when the eagles ate the fish, they were actually absorbing the DDT in the fish. And that's what eventually harmed the eagle population. So you had this sequence of events that led to some sort of a decline, but those are actually very, very rare. And most of those occurred in the past. And as a result, with changes to label restrictions and regulations on pesticides, those effects today are extremely rare. And most of the effects that we're seeing are actually related to some amphibians and things like that who tend to absorb a lot of things directly through their skin. You won't see it as much in the birds and the insects as you used to. There are a couple possible exceptions to that, but those are being looked into right now. But the vast majority of pesticides and herbicides are really not going to have a direct effect on wildlife. They're going to have more of an indirect effect. Next slide. All right, so that leads us to the last of the 4 possible causes for decline, and that's an unnatural large-scale habitat loss. So Tim, can you forward again, please? And the reason that this comes into play is that every species of wildlife has basically 3 requirements that they have to meet if they're going to be successful and keep their presence in the landscape. And they need 3 things. They need food, they need cover, and they need water. And they need all 3 of those to occur in their home range, which is that area that they occupy on on the usual scale. For example, turkeys have a home range of over 100 acres, but a rabbit might only have a home range of 2 acres, something like that. So that rabbit needs to find food, cover, and water within the 2 acres that it lives in, but the turkeys have a much broader area that they can search for or search through to find these 3 things. All 3 are equally important, but it's important to remember that water isn't a limiting factor in Pennsylvania. We tend to have lots of streams, we tend to have lots of ponds, things like that, where most animals can find water very, very easily. And that, as a result, is not something that we typically look at from a wildlife perspective, unless that water source is somehow contaminated or tainted in some way that it's not usable. And if that's the case, there are more concerns with that than just wildlife. So we're already going to be looking at that water source and trying to fix it. And the other idea to consider is that all 3 have to be locally available. Like I said, it has to occur in the home range, but it has to occur throughout the entire year. And this is one of the main ideas that folks miss about wildlife when we talk about their presence on the landscape. It's this idea of timing. Tim, could we go to the next slide, please? So when you consider the time frame for each of these things over the course of 1 year, in farmland situations, obviously the food is going to peak from spring to summer to fall as the crops follow that same path. So in the wintertime, when there aren't very many crops growing out there, because even cover crops don't have much of a presence in the winter usually, they're basically just green fuzz out in the fields depending on when they were planted. So food in the farmland is obviously going to match the growth and the ripening of the crops. So where does that leave the wildlife in terms of food sources for the winter and early spring? Well, they're going to be pretty hard up for it at that point. Water is more or less consistent throughout the year. Obviously, it's going to peak in the spring when we have more spring rains, and there would also be an increase in the fall. But again, water is not a limiting factor, and you can see in this graph that it's, pretty present throughout the landscape all the time. Cover is, plant cover, habitat, and obviously in the farmland, that's going to follow the same pattern as the crop growth in most cases. Unless a farm has a lot of set-aside areas or natural areas like buffers, field borders, things like that, cover is going to be a very, very big resource concern, especially in the wintertime. And we'll see that in the next photo. So Tim, could we advance, please? And what we see here is the same exact location. The top picture is taken in September, and you can see that the crops are still standing. So the landscape looks green, it looks full. This is what we tend to think of when we think of a farm landscape. In our minds, we always picture, corn that's 8 feet high. We always picture wheat that's nice and green. We always picture soybeans that are knee high and nice and green. But you can kind of see the foreshadowing of what's to come in this September picture by the cornfield that's harvested right in front of me when I took this picture. But as you look out across this general landscape, you can't see the ground in many cases, and there's lots of plant cover out there. The bottom picture is literally taken 1 month later after many of these crops have been harvested, and that entire landscape looks like a parking lot. There is no cover left out there. And, compared to the top picture, the amount of just what you can see with your naked eye is much, much higher. Now imagine you were a wildlife species out here in this landscape, and literally in the course of 3 weeks, every place that you had lived is gone. In human terms, this is sort of like a tornado coming through a trailer park. You go from having homes and places where you can be to having nothing almost overnight. So anything that was out in these fields has to find a new place to live. And the only thing that's consistent or permanent in this landscape are those few little clumps of trees that we see on the far left and then on the far right. So if you don't use trees, if you're a species that doesn't really exist in the forest, you have a really bad situation on your hands. This area that we're looking at is, 20 to 50 acres in size. And if you were a rabbit trying to cross any of these fields, you are very, very susceptible to predation. You're very, very susceptible to hunting or anything along those lines. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that we have to consider habitat throughout the entire course of the year. We can't just picture it in July and August when the crops are green and the crops are high, because that's not representative of the whole time that the animals are in the landscape. For at least half of the year, for the most part, for half of the year, it's going to more look like the bottom picture than it is the top picture. So we need to realize that this is a bigger issue for wildlife. Next slide. So habitat, or really just vegetation, is the key. And it's not hard to understand that more diverse vegetation offers more benefits in the terms of food sources, cover value, cover duration, which is a big one that we just saw. And a really good example, is these two pictures. Well, if you were, I won't even say a wildlife species, so to make this a little more personal for us, if someone were to drop you in the landscapes offered in these two pictures with no supplies, which one would you prefer to be in? Would you like the desert setting on the left, or would you like the forest setting on the right? Well, where are you more likely to find food? Where are you more likely to find cover if the weather should get bad? Where is, of these two, which type of cover is going to last the longest and provide the most benefit year round? Well, it's not hard to figure out that it's that picture on the right. That's going to offer a lot more opportunity for something to eat, some place to get out of the elements, and then the long-term aspect of it where you're not going to have to keep moving around. You're not going to have to be chasing that safety zone because it's going to be there all the time. It may lose its leaves in the wintertime, but it's still going to have more to offer you than the desert on the left. Next slide. So how do we affect vegetation in the farmland? Obviously, that's one of the main things that we consider, because we're almost always trying to manage things like soil erosion or water quality in the end. But how we do that, how we reach that goal, is by manipulating the plants on the surface of the land. We do that through crop rotation, crop residues by no-till, things like that, the planting of cover crops, and how we do our harvesting. All of those are very, very common things that we consider on almost every farm that we work on. And in almost every case, we're trying to increase the vegetation or the residue or the amount of green crops growing out there year round. Now that should sound pretty familiar, because that's exactly what wildlife would appreciate, is having more crops, more diversity of crops, having cover crops or other green plants on that field year round. So this is what I was talking about early on, where we're starting to see that it's not this either or situation, that many of the things that we consider good for farming systems are also good for wildlife. And you can see the values that these different things have for food and cover. The additions for cover is that if you have long-term vegetation, that's sort of the idea of the forest in the picture on the right from our last slide. And then this idea of interspersion of everything on this slide. Interspersion is the only type of vegetation concern that sort of runs contrary to farming. Tim, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of interspersion, but interspersion is just the idea of how far would an animal have to go from one safe place to another. Consider the field on the left. If, for example, when this is harvested, where would you go to be safe if you were an animal? Because as far as the eye can see, there is no long-term cover. So the animal would literally have to go across this entire landscape before it could find the next safe place. So that's not very good interspersion. Interspersion is this idea of having safe places close enough to one another that the animal is not exceptionally vulnerable when it's moving across the landscape. That's why it runs counter to farming, because farmers, understandably, would like big open fields with fewer things to drive around. You know, they don't want little tree islands in the middle of the field because it's just a pain in the butt, and it makes life more difficult for them. But that's exactly what wildlife needs. So this is one of those few times where the two don't necessarily sync up, but there are ways around that, and I'll discuss those in a minute. So crop rotation from this slide is basically, I mean, this is kind of common sense for everything that we do. A more diverse rotation offers more benefits, period. It's just that simple. For example, think about a rotation on a farm that's, corn, beans, corn, beans, something that we might find on rented farms especially, or worse yet, corn after corn after corn after corn. From a Russell II standpoint, from an erosion standpoint, from a water quality standpoint, that's typically not a good thing. Obviously, from a wildlife standpoint, a rotation like that is also not a good thing. A rotation that would include cover crops and different crop types would be far better than something that's just corn after corn after corn. And that's for a couple different reasons. That corn landscape is, like I showed before, is going to be bare for roughly half of the year. The other thing is, if you don't eat corn, why on earth would you stay in that field? And most of the wildlife species that occur in farmland do not eat corn. They're birds, they're things like that. So they're looking for insects and seeds and things. We tend to think of deer and groundhogs because they will eat the corn. But they're actually a very small portion of the landscape and the wildlife, and they're not one of the species declining. So we don't really worry about them as much. And you need to keep in mind that, because of this, it's more than just the crops in a diverse rotation that offer these benefits. A more diverse rotation offers a greater variety of insects, a greater variety of seeds, and a greater variety of prey. So if you are a predator, you're more likely to find something in this picture on the right than you are the picture on the left. Again, because if an animal doesn't eat wheat, then it's just not going to occur in these vast acres of wheat that you see on the left side. Next slide. Crop residue. This one is kind of a no-brainer. This is one we think about all the time from a plant standpoint, a soil standpoint, and a water quality standpoint. Obviously, more residues offer more benefits, and that applies to wildlife too, because it's an idea of winter cover, different winter food sources, in the terms of both grain and insects. And this one isn't hard to picture. On the left, we've got a field that's been tilled really, really well. I mean, this would be a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer's dream on the left, because it's very, very smooth. It's very, very consistent, and it's got this nice sort of clean look to it as far as many farmers are concerned. Whereas the field on the right looks a little bit messy. You've got that residue standing there. It's, a little bit more uneven. You can see the trails through it. As we head into winter, some of these patches are going to pack down, and it just doesn't look as pretty to most farmers. But for us, from a soil standpoint, from a water quality standpoint, there is no comparison. The field on the right is much better than the field on the left. And the same applies to wildlife. Again, if someone were to drop you in one of these two sites, in one of the fields, and tell you that you had to survive there for even 2 or 3 days, which field would you rather be dropped in? It's not too hard to figure that you'd want to be on the right, because at least you could maybe get some cover, you could find some warmth, you could find some food. The field on the left isn't going to offer you much of anything. And the same applies to wildlife. Next slide, please. So again, cover crops fall under the same category, which is why I used the same picture on the left. If you compare that field to the cover cropped field on the right, again, there is no comparison between the two, both from a water quality and a soil health standpoint and from wildlife benefits. The field on the right offers a variety of different plant covers, variety of different food sources, and more importantly, it's going to provide those cover and food sources throughout the fall and winter when those resources are most needed. The field on the left, if that's what it looked like going into the fall, that's going to be what it looks like throughout the entire winter and into the early spring at the very least. That field is going to look that way. You can plan on it being that way probably from November or early December until May, probably. And that's a pretty long timeline for that big of the landscape to be completely bare. Whereas the field on the right, especially if it's planted early enough after silage corn or beans or something like that, that field is actually going to provide food and cover throughout those same 6 months when the field on the left provides nothing, literally. Next slide.
Hey, Jim, there's a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to take them throughout the presentation or if you wanted to wait and hold off till the end. Sure. The first comment came from Lauren Broadbar, and she was saying, I'd love to know more about the study that you did with the animals in the field while being sprayed, like any sort of effect that may have been observed from being directly sprayed or just strictly from ingestion, sorry, not indigestion.
Okay, well, it probably did cause indigestion too, I'm not sure. That was actually done as part of my graduate work in North Carolina. And I was helping one of my fellow graduate students. And what we would do is actually put bob white chicks, which are among the most vulnerable parts of the population, in fenced pens out in a crop field when the farmers were getting ready to spray down their cover crops. So imagine a miniature version of a movable chicken coop, out there in the crop field. And they would actually spray right over top of these little miniature chicken coops with the birds in it. And before anybody tries to report me to PETA or the Humane Society, we did have all of the necessary permits and approvals to do this. It wasn't just something that we decided we were going to do some random testing on vulnerable wildlife species. But the findings for that were really not surprising, because even the chicks with that fluffy down that they have on them, those feathers are really good protection from the elements. And just like ducks can stay dry in water, their skin doesn't get wet because the feathers shed the water. The same thing happened with the bob white chicks. It was more or less just like getting rained on for them. Once the sprayer passed over them, they would literally shake it off. They might be damp for a little bit, but they would dry off, and then they went about their business as if nothing happened. They keep in mind also that when a spray is applied to the field, it has been diluted to the point where it is safe for use in the environment. And as a result, most people think that, I'm going to take, Roundup straight out of the jug and I'm going to put it in a super soaker and hose down this bird. That's not the case. The diluted Roundup is, safe enough for human handling and things like that. The biggest concern with most pesticides and herbicides is in the undiluted form, in the concentrated form straight out of the container. By the time it's being put on these fields, it's following the label allowed amounts of concentrations. So those chicks were unaffected by the spray itself. But what happened there was, the spray killed the winter weeds, it killed the plants that were out there in the field, and that ended up reducing the insect population considerably. And we would see that maybe, a week or two later. So what you would see was the bobwhite chicks were fine from the spray, but 2 or 3 weeks later, we would start to see really drastic decreases in their weight gain and growth because they lost their food source and they couldn't put on the pounds and the, well, not pounds because it's a small bobwhite, but they couldn't put on the weight and grow and mature at the same rate that they would have in a field that wasn't sprayed. Again, it's not a direct effect from the spray itself, but it's an indirect effect on their food source. So that's the distinction there. And hopefully that addresses your question. If not, please send me an email later on and we can talk about it in greater depth.
Very
Next
good.
question, Dib.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, if someone is continuously in corn and doesn't want to rotate, is it possible to plant some rows along the borders of the fields to support other wildlife that don't eat corn?
Yes, it is. And an idea like this, those things that we would plant along the edges of the field, let's just kind of cut to the chase and let's call them field borders and sort of be done with it. In the sense that, we know we're going to put something else out there for different reasons. And, a lot of folks will think along the lines of a food plot, maybe, where they're going to say, well, let's plant some brassicas or something, some clovers along the edge of the field. And again, that comes back to the idea of feeding deer in particular. We're not quite so interested in managing for deer in Pennsylvania because we don't have to. They're everywhere, they're universal. In most cases, we have too many already. So we would actually be better off managing those edges for something else because the deer will use that area anyhow. So, rather than planting something else along those edges for deer consumption, let's plant something out there that might provide some winter cover or, food sources or insect sources for a lot of other species instead. And the deer would still use it, guaranteed.
Very good. And the next question, are there certain winter cover crops that are better, or does the type of crop not matter as much?
That's sort of a trick question in the sense that any cover that's out there over the winter is better than none. So for example, the wheat stubble or the oat stubble that we saw the picture of when we were talking about tillage, that's still winter cover. And smaller animals in particular would still be able to use that. They would use it for cover only, and they might be able to pick up some waste grain here and there. But being as the vegetation is completely dead, there won't be as much insect food source there and things like that. Versus this picture on the right on the slide we're currently seeing, because of the diversity of the plants and the amount of different seeds. There's sunflowers in there, there's buckwheat in there, there's some small grains and things like that in there. There's going to be a lot more variety of what's available. And of course that variety is going to spur more variety among the insect base that's available. So I wouldn't say that there's it's thinking of a good way to try to present this. Think of it more as like a gradation, a scale of what's good and what's not. In a situation like this, the picture on the far left is not good, and the picture on the far right is probably up there among the best options. But small grain stubble, standing grain corn stubble that's about a foot high, all of those still are better than the one on the left. They're just not quite as good as the one on the right in this case. But keep in mind that stubble has to be of an adequate height to provide this cover. So if somebody had grain corn, they harvested it, but then they came across the field with a mower to chop that cover down. Maybe they're worried about army rootworms or something like that. If they cut that cover down, then it's really not that much different than the picture on the left. There will be residues out there, so there would be some insects and things like that, but you lose that cover aspect. And a lot of wildlife would still not be interested or not be able to use that field. So keep that scale in mind. Anything is better than nothing, but aiming for the better end of that scale is always going to be more beneficial to wildlife.
Very good. And then it's not a question, just a comment, but some herbicides have tremendously bad effects to eyes. And that was just a comment. So with that, Jim, we can go back to your slides.
Okay. Okay, so next one, please. So, you know, I mentioned just in one of those answers the idea of food plots. And they do provide cover and food during the stressful times of the year when resources are scarce. But again, most of these food plots are set up for game species. And they're set up specifically for the purpose of hunting over them in many cases. In very few situations are a food plot set up to specifically provide food without any kind of ulterior motive. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And most food plots really don't benefit the other species of wildlife. For example, in the two pictures here, you've got corn on the left, which is great for the pheasants, even when it's dormant like this. And then you've got the different mustards and brassicas and things on the right, which are always used for deer, for antler growth and weight gain and things like that. But even in both of these pictures, you know, a rabbit is not going to be interested in the cornfield on the left. A songbird really would have no use for that cornfield. And the same would apply to the clover or to the brassica plot on the right. You know, rabbits might be in there for a little while, but you won't find any songbirds in there. You won't find any really, you know, predator species, and really very few prey species in terms of small mammals, just because it's not a preferred food source. It's a preferred food source for the deer, and that's why humans plant it. You know, so that brings me back to this idea of a field border. Many times, rather than advocating for food plots, we would rather advocate for a field border that has, you know, long-term permanent vegetation in it, with a mix of maybe grasses and wildflowers and things like that, to provide that diverse food source and diverse insect base. There's nothing wrong with food plots. They're better than nothing. Like I said before, you know, they are better than nothing. They're just not the best choice for a variety of species. If a farmer wants to manage for hunting deer, yes, it's an option. But we shouldn't be out there selling this option as the Cadillac version of how they could manage for wildlife, because it simply isn't. It's a very specific practice with a very specific goal in mind. And to be honest, managing for wildlife is not usually one of those goals. Hunting wildlife is one of the goals. Next slide. So let's go with a real world example here. And typically this works better when we're in person, all in one room. But you'll get the idea even from this slide. So say we have two food options for today. And this is what you can have all day, not just for lunch, but this is all you can eat all day. This is the only thing available to you. You can have either a bowl of iceberg lettuce, or you can have a bowl of mixed greens with carrots, tomatoes, broccoli, sunflower seeds, egg, bacon bits, and croutons. Really, both are salads, right? But which one would you choose, and why? I'm guessing most of you would choose option B. Why? Because option 1 or option A is really, really boring, and it's not going to offer you a whole lot in terms of nutritional value. And that leads to the next question: which of these would benefit you more? And obviously that answer is also B, because you're getting more of the nutrients, you're getting a diverse variety of the vitamins, the proteins, the things that you need from that option B. And this is the same choice that wildlife would make. But in many landscapes, the only option available to them is A. You know, we've talked about this. Instead of iceberg lettuce, their choice would be, do you eat wheat? Do you eat corn? You know, something like that. So this goes into the idea of crop diversity, residues, cover crops, and food plots. This is sort of a real world human example that applies those concepts to how wildlife also faces their landscape. Next slide. So this brings us on to vegetation type, and it's no secret that perennial plants would offer more benefits. This is true in many cases with farm systems, as well as habitat value. So the picture on the left is this idea of, we've got a cornfield, and I always like this picture because it shows a common practice, at least in the center of the state, sort of the limestone ridge and valleys, and then also the southeastern parts of the state, where late in the summer, a lot of times farmers are starting to run short on some of their feed for their cattle. So they'll start taking the outer edges of their field as silage cutting. So you end up having very little residue, very little stalks left in these fields. And once they have enough of that, they'll leave the rest of the corn, and they might harvest it and leave the residues in the center of the field. So even those residues don't compare to the grass field on the right in terms of soil protection, water quality, and of course, habitat. It's not too hard to see that the fields on the left, even the field with the residue in it, the portion of the field with the residue in it, offer way less than the field on the right with that diversity of cover. And those grasses will still be there throughout the winter. They may turn brown, they may go dormant, but they will still be in the landscape, and they will still be offering a lot more benefit than anything visible on the left. Next slide, please. So here's the example of interspersion. And the idea here is to reduce the distance to long-term cover. Again, a real simple way to put it is, if you were a rabbit or a songbird in that top picture, and you needed to escape a predator, you needed to get away from a tractor, something like that, you're going to have to go the whole way to that tree line in the distance. And that's a long haul. That is a fairly long distance. You can see there's a strip of corn, right in front of that wood line, sort of in the right half of the picture. And look how small that corn is. If that's 8 or 10 foot tall corn, that gives you an idea of just how big that field is to get across. So you've got a long distance to go to make it to safety. Versus the picture on the bottom, where you have these separated tree islands, those distances are much, much smaller. We can easily picture birds, for example, just kind of flitting back and forth between these tree islands. So the bottom picture is much better for wildlife than the top picture. For a farmer, that top picture is much easier to deal with and much easier to work in than that bottom picture. And I will be 100% honest with you, that bottom picture, those tree islands that we see out there are not the farmer's choice, okay? Those tree islands have been left because they're full of rocks from when they cleared the field. So they took all the rocks off the field and they had to put them somewhere. So they piled them up in these sections, and the trees grew up around them. So the farmer can't farm those areas, and that's why those trees are there. So this is the only concern where a wildlife preference goes directly against our farming preference. And it's kind of hard to overcome because equipment and farming systems work better in these long straight rows and things like that. And we're just adverse to farming around something if we don't have to. Okay, so there you go. Other direction, Tim. Let's go one more, please.
Sorry about that. Is that where you want to be?
Yeah, this is it. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to example number 2, and this covers both the idea of winter cover and interspersion. So let's say there's, we're all in the same big room again, and there are 12 donuts hidden in the room, okay? 6 of them are in plain view on the table in the back. 6 of them are hidden in different places all around the room. The easy question is, which donuts are going to get eaten first? Obviously, the 6 in plain view on the table in the back. It's going to be a free-for-all, right? Because we're all in training, we're all bored, we all want those, that snack to keep us going. So whoever gets there first is going to get a donut, all right? But those donuts are out there, they're just available, there is no trouble in finding that donut. In comparison, though, which donuts might survive the whole day in terms of not being found and eaten? Well, obviously, it's those other 6, the ones that are hidden in different places all around the room. Why? Because they're hidden. They have someplace, they're not out in plain sight. They're not readily available. They're just not as easy to find. And this is the idea that comes back to the value of crop residues, cover crops in particular, food plots, and this idea of interspersion. If animals have a place to hide, they're just going to survive longer. Think of them as that donut that's hidden in the room versus the donut in plain view. For a hawk or for a hunter, a rabbit in a crop field is a donut in plain view versus a rabbit in a field border or a brushy edge or a hedgerow. Those are the donuts that are hidden. And to be honest, a lot of hunters would prefer, the idea of finding prey in a more challenging landscape. There's more satisfaction and there's more enjoyment from actually having to hunt the animal versus sitting in a tree stand at the edge of a crop field and just shooting the first thing that comes into view. So it's an idea that most folks don't think of on their own when it comes to landowners and farmers, but when we bring it up, they're actually very responsive to it. Next slide, please. So how do these resource concerns for wildlife fit in with farming? And this comes back to the idea that, I'd really like folks to start considering the ag landscape, as a combination of systems rather than just individual practices, and that these systems can complement each other and serve multiple purposes. And this is one of the things that we see on the right here. When you look at a landscape, a farming landscape, we try to get as many possible beneficial practices out there as we can. And we're typically doing those practices for soil and for water reasons. And they're things like windbreaks, forested buffers, filter strips, grassed waterways, things that we deal with a lot and things that we see almost every day. So next slide, Tim. So what are the wildlife benefits of those practices? We know what the conservation benefits are because that's why we do them. We do that every day. We know that they're going to help hold the soil in place. We know that they're going to help improve water quality. But, the wildlife benefits of these practices also count, even if we aren't thinking about them actively. So the idea of crop rotation, crop residue, all of these things that we've talked about before, we know those have good benefits for wildlife. We know that wildlife will respond positively to having these things in the landscape. But next, hit the button again, Tim. So how do these same practices affect things like soil erosion, soil health, nutrient management, water quality, and then the big one that most folks don't think about, how do these things impact the farmer's profitability? Not their yield, not the average yield off of the field, but their actual farm profitability. And the answer is the same. It's going to increase their soil retention. It's going to increase their soil health. It's going to improve their ability to do nutrient management. Because if you have those filter strips, those field borders, again, your nutrient concerns are reduced because they're not going to be able to run off the field as much. And this is present even in the Act 38 regulations, where if you have a permanent strip of vegetation around the outer 35 feet of your field, you can spread across the rest of the field. If you don't have that 35 foot of vegetation around the end, around the outside, then your spreading is limited more to the center of the field. Water quality falls under the same category. Having more cover on the ground, of having more long-term or perennial cover in the areas where it's needed, obviously a big benefit for water quality. And the idea of the farmer's profitability, these areas where we might want to, obviously, if they're doing cover crops and crop residues, they're not losing their soil. They're getting some natural fertilizer benefits from those things, whether it's, legumes in the cover crops that help fix nitrogen, whether it's just organic matter that's going to be decomposing slowly over time and therefore improving the soil tilth and water retention and even providing some of those nutrient requirements just as sort of compost as it breaks down over time. All of those things are going to factor in. Plus, consider the idea that if a farmer were to set aside some of their lowest yielding areas, which typically tend to be along the edges of the field, wet areas, really rocky areas with shallow soils, things like that, if they set those areas aside, they're no longer going to be losing those input costs. They're no longer going to have to fertilize it. They're no longer going to have to plant it. They're no longer going to have to spray it. They can let it come up to long-term vegetation. And honestly, their bottom line for those acres will improve. They can actually make more money by farming fewer acres if the acres that they give up are the acres with really low, really poor yield. But that's the difference between yield and profitability. Folks will often think that, if they have a yield meter, they're going to say, well, this field gave me 150 bushels to the acre. No, it didn't. Not really. It gave you an average of 150 bushels to the acre, but most of that came from the center of the field. The outer edges of the field may have produced 60 or 70 bushels to the acre. And if your break-even price or your break-even yield was 90 bushels to the acre before you started making any money, then all of a sudden you're losing money off that outer edge of the field. So why continue to lose money? Why not set that area aside into something else and actually increase your profitability by farming less acres? And I know that idea is counterintuitive to a lot of folks, because we're constantly inundated with this idea that if you want to make more money farming, you have to farm more acres. In reality, if you want to make money farming, you also need to farm the profitable acres and not be afraid to set aside the unprofitable acres. And that's an idea that a few of your instructors will stress for years to come. This isn't the only time you're going to hear it. But please keep that in mind. Next slide. So, like I said, we know many of these all of these practices are good for many things. So why couldn't we tweak them just a little bit and also make them good for wildlife? For example, if we're going to do cover crops on a field, is it okay to maybe throw some buckwheat into that mix and get some pollinator benefits from it, get some food and cover benefits from it for songbirds? Also knowing that buckwheat is excellent for soil tilth and breaking up surface compaction and things like that. So again, this idea of being able to benefit wildlife and agriculture both at the same time, that it's not that either or situation. They can both exist, they can both benefit, and they can both have this fairly harmonious relationship. And this, again, is an idea that you'll hear pretty much in Boot Camp 2, a couple other trainings that I'm going to be involved with, because it is a real world fact that these two things can coexist and can actually benefit one another. Next slide, please. So in summary, we're going to just touch on those 3 points from before, that we started with. We wanted to understand why fish and wildlife resource concerns are something that we have to consider during planning. And the reason for that is, like I said, they're a public resource. They're protected legally, just the same as air and water are protected. So we have to consider them. We don't have a choice. It's a requirement. But I hope you've learned here today that it's also something that we should be thinking about, because it's not an either or situation. We can benefit both without even trying too hard, to be honest. We wanted to understand the resource concerns of importance to wildlife. And that is, again, food and cover. But the idea there is that it has to be across the landscape and throughout the year, keeping in mind that in most ag systems, roughly half of the year is almost uninhabitable for wildlife because the fields are bare. So that's a big issue. And then to begin to view agricultural landscape as this combination of systems, and that those systems can really effectively complement one another, and that the wildlife potential of many of the practices that we install regularly is huge. That we can benefit wildlife very much just with our choice of crop rotations, tillage types, planting times and systems, and all of those things. So hopefully those 3 points will stick with you and will maybe help you see our ag landscapes in a more wildlife friendly way. And hopefully you've realized that, even if a farmer doesn't say specifically that wildlife is a resource concern of theirs, that we can still work to benefit those songbirds, the pollinators, some of the smaller mammals and things like that on their farm without causing any harm to their crop growth. Folks, like I mentioned before, most folks will think of deer and groundhogs when you start talking about wildlife, and it's up to us to educate them to something that's a little bit different. Okay, next slide, please. And with that, I'm all wrapped up. Do we have any questions or concerns in the chat that I can answer?
Nothing in the chat right now. Any questions from anyone? We can do some of your questions, Jim.
Yeah, that would be fine. I know I submitted quite a few, but I don't know if we need to go through all of them.
Yeah.
We'll see how, we'll see how receptive the group is to that. We're doing pretty well on time, so if they want to do all 5, that's good with me. If they don't, that's also good.
Okay, hang on. I've got the first one here. Let me share my screen, and we'll see if Teams is working better now. Let me share my a different screen, rather. All right. So the first question is, which of the following is not a public resource? Water, wildlife, air, or forests? And I will copy the link and put it in the chat. And Lauren Barber says, let's do all 5. They've been fun. Okay, well, I appreciate that. And I'm going to, for those that are maybe having trouble with the chat, I think there's maybe 2 people out there. I will send this to you through an email. And we're getting some responses coming in. Just give it a minute. So it looks like majority of people are saying forest, Jim. What do you think?
That is absolutely correct. Of that list, forests are the only thing that aren't necessarily protected by law. And they're not the only thing, or pardon me, they are the only thing that is 100% under the control of the person who owns the land where they occur. And the best way to think of this is, there's no restriction if someone wants to go out and harvest wood from their forest, unless there's water running through that forest. Then they have to have this setback from the creek and things like that. But if you've got an upland forest on the top of a hill and you decide to log it, nobody can stop you. There's no legal, it's not considered a public resource. And those folks who said that, wildlife wasn't a public resource, and I think there was one person who said that water wasn't a public resource, please go back and talk with folks in your office, because especially the water, that's something that we have to consider as a major public resource concern every time we're on the farm. I would say water quality is one of the highest priorities that we face on a daily basis on farm systems. And then obviously, my talk here was about the fact that wildlife is also considered a public resource concern. Unlike forests, where you can go out and manipulate them whenever you want, you can't go out and just shoot a fox anytime that you want. You can't shoot a deer in April, for example, and not face some consequences for that, because it is a public resource concern and it is managed at the state level by a state agency. Okay, but
Great.
Most of you got it correct, and thank you for paying attention.
Well done, group. The second question I put in the chat and I sent an email. The question is, which of the following wildlife groups has some of the fastest declining populations? And we're starting to get some responses on that already. Looks like a lot of people think grassland, farmland, wildlife, Jim. What do you think?
And that is 100% correct. The aquatic species that a few folks have chosen, they are also declining, specific species in particular. And that's something that we are also concerned about, but it's not something that we can address as easily because we don't typically work in the aquatic systems. We tend to work on the land around those aquatic systems. So we can have an effect on them, but many of those species that are declining are actually, hardcore 100% dependent on aquatic systems. And then someone answered with waterfowl. Overall, waterfowl are not declining because actually a lot of wetland species are on the increase whenever wetlands are present. The issue there is that, if we let wetlands decline too much, then those waterfowl are also going to follow suit and they will eventually decline. But they're holding pretty steady right now. But yes, grassland birds in particular, and then as a result, farmland wildlife, they are among the fastest declining wildlife populations out there. And it's not hard to figure out why. How many large grasslands do we see in the landscape on the average day? And if you start thinking about that, then you'll see very quickly why those populations are declining.
Very good. And then I put the next question in the chat. Which of the following is the cause of most wildlife population declines? And that's also emailed, and we're getting some responses in already. And answers are pretty consistent, so I think you hit this pretty hard, Jim.
Yeah, I did. And there's a reason for that. That habitat loss is the biggest factor for all of this. And it's one of the factors that people have the hardest time acknowledging because we tend to not realize the scale at which we are destroying those habitats in grassland and farmland situations because we don't think of it as habitat. We think of it as that tree row along the edge of the field that's shading our crops. So we push it out, we get rid of it. We think of it as, that grassy strip or that, in that waste corner that, hey, if I got rid of that, I could have another acre to grow corn on. And that's really, it's so nobody thinks that it's not them is kind of what it comes back to. I'm not the one taking out habitat because I'm only pushing out, 1 acre of tree line. Well, if everybody's pushing out 1 acre of tree line, it's not hard to figure out what that adds up to.
Excellent. Very good. And I think that's what I have, Jim, for wildlife. Okay. And then I think the next question is on wetland awareness.
Okay. And that's tomorrow. We don't need to bombard people with that today.
Oh, I actually had that on the agenda for today. Are you?
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Are you able to give a chat on wetland awareness, or
sure,
should we back
right
that up?
Into it.
Because we can
roll.
Adjust. Okay.
No, we can roll right into it. That's no problem.
Hang on. Let's take a. Can we do a 10-minute break? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Let's restart this. And I'm going to start our 10-minute break, folks, and we will we'll come back in 10 minutes and start with wetland awareness. And Jim, are you there?
Yes, I am, Tim.
Hey, sorry about that mix-up. I maybe the agenda changed and I don't recall. So I apologize about that.
No, actually, I think it was probably me.
But I wanted to say you got as much time as you want. I've been telling participants that we are sticking to the agenda loosely, but our goal is to get everyone out by lunchtime each day. So don't rush or anything. We got all the time in the world.
Well, and I'm hoping that I won't use that much time for them. I just, you know, I don't think I'll need much more than an hour total, and that's with questions and everything. So
Sounds good.
Hopefully we can wrap it up by 11:30 or so. Maybe I'll go into fewer explanations than I did with the first one, just to make sure we hit it.
Whatever works for you, but we've I just wanted to make sure that you knew we've got time.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, but it's what, the third day so far, so if we cut them loose a little bit early, it's probably not going to be the end of the world.
Yeah, no one will complain. I'm hungry already, so
Exactly. I think that's
Thanks,
why
Jim.
I think that's why I had the coughing fit at the start of mine, because I had just scarfed down a snack so that I could get through it.
I was really getting hungry when your first question you posed about the lettuce and the salad bowl.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
But
That
hey,
one
very good.
that one actually works really well when we're in the Keystone Conference Center. With the donuts and stuff, especially because you can look around the room and it's really obvious that, if there were 6 of them in the back versus 6 of them hidden around the room, the ones in the back are going to get hammered.
Yeah. Okay, folks, I think our 10 minutes is up, and we're gonna start this session out with a question for to get back into the groove of things. So, Jim, is this question good? Which of the following landforms are legally protected as a warm up?
Yep,
Okay.
that's fine.
Let me share this in the chat. And then I will also email it out for the 1 or 2 people that are having chat trouble.
Somebody asked, they said they can only select one option. That's because there really should only be one selected.
I should have made it harder and allowed multiple selections.
Next time.
Next time, yes.
And Tim, do you mind doing the slide again?
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
Okay.
I got it. It's all ready.
And I know that's a little frustrating to have to, be the slide advancer like that, but it's just not working on my system for some reason.
I'm happy to do it. And if I'm slow on a slide, it might be because Pete's over chatting. Okay, I think we're getting a lot of responses, Jim. And looks like a lot of people said wetlands, 35 said wetlands, and 5 said streams. So
right.
That probably leads us into your presentation pretty well.
Yes, exactly. And actually both answers are correct. Or it'd be more accurate to say that, both landforms are protected. But it's important to remember that it's the water in the streams that's actually protected, whereas it's the landform of wetlands. It's one of the few actual landforms, but we'll talk about that in just a second.
And then I have 2 more questions. Do you want to save those for later, Jim?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Give them something to look forward to,
Sounds good. Let me transition over to your slides. And can you see that now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm going to go to screen mode. Okay.
Okay, so as Tim mentioned, and as it's on the agenda, this presentation is going to change gears a little bit. We're not going to be talking about wildlife anymore. We're going to be talking about wetlands. And I want to stress right up front that the intent of this presentation is not to make folks experts on wetlands. I know there are a lot of concerns and a lot of people get very, very anxious when we start talking about wetlands because there seems to be this assumption that everybody needs to know exactly what every wetland looks like and be able to recognize every wetland type and things like that. That is not the point of this presentation, and to be quite honest, it's not going to be the point of any presentation that most folks on this call are going to ever have to sit through. For our agency and the districts and everybody who's listening in, there is a very small group of people who are considered to be wetland experts. And unless you know you're part of that group, you don't have to be an expert. What we're shooting for is an understanding of the laws and the regulations behind wetland protection, and then a general knowledge and understanding of where you can find wetlands in the landscape, and then what we should do about them once we find them. But we're going to be looking at what are wetlands and how do we specifically say this area is a wetland versus this area over here that is not a wetland? Who cares about wetlands? That's a main question that we have to address. How do we identify them? And then how do we deal with them? once we have identified them. Next slide, please. So what are wetlands? In the most basic sense, they are exactly what their name applies. They are wet land. And that land portion of this name is vital because as you can see in these pictures, a pond, a deep water pond is not a wetland because where the water is located, there's no land. It's all water, especially in the center of a pond like this. And it is just that. It's water. Whereas the bottom picture is a wet land because you actually have land, you've got soil that is saturated. So it's water and soil mixed. That it may not be a true slurry when it's mixed. It may be just water within the pores of the soil and things like that. But you do have this addition that there is water and land occupying the same space. Next slide, please. Wetlands are areas that show all three of the criteria listed on this screen. They have to have hydrology. Hydrology is just another name for a sufficient amount of water. So when we talk about hydrology, we're really talking about water. They have to have hydric soils, and they have to have hydrophytic plants. And I'll talk about what those three criteria mean in just a second. But it's only where these three things occur at the same time, it's only where they overlap, that we have a wetland. For example, if you've got hydrology, but you don't have hydric soils or hydrophytic plants, it's not a wetland. And a prime example of this might be a spring seep that pops out of the side of a rocky hill. You've got hydrology, you might have water there year round, but you don't have saturated soils, you don't have hydrophytic plants coming up, so therefore it's not a wetland. On the other flip side, you may have hydric soils, and that would be mapped by a soil scientist or shown on the soils map, and it may come up on, when you pull a soils map, it may show that it's supposed to be hydric, but you go out there and it's really not that hydric, and there's no saturation, there's no hydrophytic plants present, therefore you don't have a wetland. So again, you have to have all three of these in the same location at the same time to have a true wetland. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the definitions of all of these things because, for NRCS, it's easy for us to get lost in the terminology, but what I like to do is try to turn that into a real world explanation that folks can remember and it can help them do their job. So the idea of having hydrology, hydric soils, hydrophytic vegetation in the same location really boils down to this plain English statement. There's enough water to saturate the soil often enough and long enough to create different plant communities. Okay, that's really all it is. You've got water in the soil long enough to change the plants on top of the soil. And a good example is, these two pictures again. I'm a big believer in the idea of pictures being able to convey an idea better than I can. So the picture on the left, you've got that skunk cabbage. You can see that area is very muddy, very saturated, and you have a noticeably different plant community. That's actually me in the picture, and you can see where I'm standing has a very different plant community than the area just immediately in front of me, where the ground starts to slope up. There is no more skunk cabbage. You start to see trees growing and things like that. Compared to where I'm standing, there are no trees. It's all skunk cabbage. So you have this very clear distinction between plant communities. That distinction also applies to where the water is in the landscape. So it's pretty easy to see in that one why we would consider one area a wetland, but another area literally 10 feet away is not a wetland. Okay, the picture on the right is a little bit trickier because you have these depressional areas in a crop field. There is water present, okay, and that water is saturating the soil long enough to cause something to happen, but because we're in a crop field, it's hard to tell if the plant communities would be noticeably different. Okay, so the idea here is the one on the left we should be able to look at that, and even someone without specialized training should, the light bulb should come on, and they should be able to say, hey, I'm pretty sure that's a wetland. The one on the right, you don't necessarily need to be able to say with certainty that these areas are wetlands, but it better catch your attention, at least, that, hey, those spots are something different. And even if they aren't wetlands, maybe we need to manage them differently. Okay, next slide. So who cares about wetlands? And the typical answer here when you ask folks this question, especially in the ag community, one of the first answers you get is regulatory agencies like DEP, the Corps of Engineers, EPA. Those are the ones who come up first. But then you'll get the other explanations of, well, it's the tree huggers and the environmentalists and people like me who are biologists. Those are the only people who care about wetlands in the eyes of many folks. But a better question to ask is, well, who cares about wetlands after they're gone? Okay, because this goes back to the old adage that, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And when it's gone, then you start getting comments and concerns from hunters. In our last presentation, somebody mentioned the idea of waterfowl. Well, if we get rid of all our wetlands, we're going to end up getting rid of all our waterfowl. And actually, a lot of the nationwide conservation efforts all started with hunters who were worried about waterfowl populations. So, the hunters are actually a prime motivating force behind a lot of conservation efforts nationwide. One that very few people think about are drought-prone areas. If you look at the states in the far west, California, some of those other ones who are having tremendous amounts of legal battles and concerns over groundwater and the usage of that groundwater, it's really shocking to compare those states, to have a list of those states and then compare that to the states across the country who have drained most of their wetlands. For example, California has drained over 90% of their wetlands. As a result, they don't have groundwater recharge. So yeah, they've got a problem in terms of water availability. And then the third group that people don't think of is flood victims. And the prime example of this is Hurricane Katrina, when that came in and the situation they had in New Orleans. As we all know, somebody somewhere along the line, some genius decided to build New Orleans below seawater level. And they built this giant seawall around it to basically keep the water out of the city. What we don't hear about typically is that there used to be about 50 miles of wetland between the area of New Orleans and the ocean edge. Those wetlands were destroyed and replaced by developments. So when Hurricane Katrina hit and the sea level rose temporarily because of the giant amount of water that was coming in, there were no wetlands in place anymore to absorb or slow those flows. So that water literally blasted across 50 miles of area and managed to hit that seawall with a lot more force and a lot more volume than it would have had those wetlands still been in place. That was something that was even news to me when I first heard about it, because it just wasn't talked about. Nobody ever mentioned it, but that's why I bring it up today. If wetlands could affect something as drastic as Hurricane Katrina, that alone should get our attention and make us realize some of the value that they have for us as humans. And granted, they cause us problems every once in a while, but in general terms, their benefits far outweigh the problems that they cause. And then the other thing that's, and I touched on this a little bit with California, but any of us, which is also all of us, who rely on groundwater. So if you have a well, if you have even city water that comes from, a larger well that's, pumped into storage and then comes out through a commercial setup, if you're relying on groundwater, that means you're relying on groundwater recharge. And streams and ponds do not recharge groundwater. And that's what this picture shows from the bottom of the page here. The wetland on the left, wetlands by their very nature will hold water, but that water eventually soaks into the ground and disappears. You know, it's basically being infiltrated into the ground. Whereas a pond is deliberately made to be watertight. If it's leaking, it's a bad pond, you know, and we try to fix it. And that's what a lot of folks don't realize. They'll look at a pond and say, oh, you know, hey, this is where some water's coming from. No, it's not, because the whole idea of a pond is to not lose water. So that water is just sitting there and it's not doing much of anything to recharge groundwater. Whereas that wetland right beside it is doing all of the work in this case. So you have some water infiltration, you know, through the soil itself on the broader landscape. But because wetlands are in these low areas, in these depressions that tend to collect and hold water, they actually do far more water infiltration than the average portion of the landscape does. They have a disproportionately high amount of groundwater recharge compared to any other feature in the landscape. Okay, next slide, please. So why do we specifically in our agencies and groups care about wetlands? Well, first off, it's our job because they're just like wildlife, they're natural resources, but in this case, they provide very clear public benefits. I already mentioned groundwater recharge, which is a big one, but water quality and filtration is another one, because they're in those they're located in situations where they catch water and they hold water and they have vegetation in them. That's the other main thing. So, you know, that vegetation can physically act like a screen or a sieve to catch sediment or catch pollutants and even sometimes larger debris that's flowing across the land surface. And they really do act like a filter for surface water. They do flood absorption. I already talked about Hurricane Katrina and what they can do there. And of course, they're providing high quality wildlife habitat. And that's one of the things that people tend to focus on. Especially in the ag community, you know, they tend to think that people want to save wetlands because that's where the ducks are, or that's where the frogs are, things like that. And while that's true, wildlife habitat is really only one of like 6 well-defined benefits that wetlands provide. So when people get a little bit upset about, you know, wetland conservation, sometimes it helps to remind them, you know, that the wildlife is a very small portion of what they do for us, literally like 1/6. So there are, you know, 5/6 of the things that they do are really good things that most people care about a whole lot more than habitat, possibly. And then in addition to it being our job, it's the law. Wetlands are the only land form as far as, you know, a surface feature on the land that are protected by law. And not just one law. They're protected by NEPA, the Food Security Act, different executive orders, all sorts of things down throughout the years. In addition, they're protected by NRCS policy. So if we're on the clock as an NRCS employee, or if you're on the clock as a district employee working under our engineering approval or something like that, you have to, as a requirement of your job, you have to consider wetlands as a resource concern that need to be protected. Okay, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. Next slide. So how do we identify wetlands? And I mentioned this before, but I want to drive this point home. There are wetland specialists within NRCS, and they are a very clearly defined group of people. If you don't think you're on the wetland specialist team, you're not. You know, it's one of these things where you will know if you are considered a wetland specialist. So don't lose sleep over that. But those wetland specialists are going to use a variety of things. For example, the Food Security Act, the Corps of Engineers manuals and things like that. And they are going to have additional training and expertise, and they're going to keep that training and expertise current every year. You know, like I said, there is no chance that you will be on the wetland specialist team and not know it, because it will be a fairly significant portion of your time. But with that said, everyone, so everyone on this call, everyone who's ever taken these trainings before, we all have the capability to recognize wetlands, even if we aren't doing it officially or with any sort of expertise. And the reason we can recognize these wetlands is that it all boils down to two really simple questions. And those questions are, is this area different from its surroundings? And if it is different, what's making it different? Okay, next slide, please. So as we look at these two questions, you know, and I've used these two pictures from before, are these areas different from their surroundings? And that's pretty obvious in both cases. The picture on the left, it's not hard to see that that area is different. I already explained part of the reasoning behind that is, you know, you've got this very noticeable difference in slope, very noticeable difference in soil saturation, very noticeable differences in vegetation. You've got the wet soils, skunk cabbage, no woody vegetation, all of those things occurring in that spot, which even if you're not a wetland specialist, you should be able to look at that and go, something here is different from everything around it. The picture on the right with the crops, not quite as obvious as the one on the left, but you know, you've got ponding there, you've got crop failure there, both of which should catch your attention and make you think, yeah, those spots are different from the ones around them. Well, what makes them different? So we have to move on to that second question. You know, why are they different? And let's go back to the definition of a wetland. You know, water saturating the soil often enough and long enough to create noticeably different plant communities. Both of these areas meet that definition. And because what's making it different? The amount of water, okay, and how long that water is present in these areas. If the water wasn't there, we would see something totally different in both of these pictures. The picture on the right, those ponded areas, if there wasn't water present, they would just look like the rest of the field. Okay, they would just be a depression in the field with no standing water, no crop failures, things like that. The picture on the left, if we didn't have long-term water there, it would look like the rest of the forest in the background. It would have trees, it would have some brushy undergrowth and things like that. Okay, so usually it's the water and the presence of water that gives a wetland away. Next slide, please. So here's an example that's a little bit more challenging, but it's also something that we're all more likely to encounter in our daily jobs. So the area marked off with the yellow dashes, you know, is that area different from its surroundings? Well, I hope we could all look at that and say pretty easily, yeah, that area is different. How do we know that area is different? Well, in this case, the vegetation is a dead giveaway, okay? The rest of this little paddock is grazed down to the soil surface, but obviously the plants in that little triangle area have pretty much been untouched, okay? So what makes this area different? Well, the vegetation does, for one thing. The animal usage of this area also makes it different. And you've got these plants, you've got cattails and sedges and, you know, the white flowers that are blooming there, and things that are vastly different from the areas around them. So this is one of those spots where hopefully when you see this, the red flag will come up. And even if it's not a full-blown wetland, even if you're just looking at it from a pasture management standpoint, this area needs to be treated differently from every area around it. And why is that? Well, the cattle, you know, even the livestock themselves are telling us that this area is different. They just don't want to go in it, right? And they just don't want to eat what's there, to the point where their avoidance of it is very, very plain to see, right? But again, let's think of the wetland definition. Water saturating the soil often enough and long enough to create a different plant community. This one's a slam dunk, just like the last ones. You know, obviously we have a different plant community. Obviously the soils are saturated because if you look at it, you can see where it's all pugged up just from the animals walking through it or walking around it. And then you've got a, you know, really obvious difference in plant communities. Right? Next slide. And I want to point out that, these things are something that you can see without being a specialist. It doesn't take any sort of additional training to be able to walk into that pasture and say, hey, something's different here. This isn't like the rest of it. So here's an example in a crop field. Is this area different from its surroundings? Yeah, for sure. The most noticeable thing is it's not cropped, right? Right off the bat, it kind of hits us in the face that, we've got corn and crops planted on either side, but the farmer is very, very actively avoiding this area. It's got wet soils. It's got reed canary grass. It doesn't have any woody plants. You can see at the top of this picture, at the upper end of this particular drainage draw, there's woody trees galore. There's mature forest up there even. But then all of a sudden we hit this point where the trees just stop and you don't have trees anymore. Why is that? Well, it's because this lower area is different somehow. What makes it different? Again, it's the presence of that long-term water. Water is saturating this soil often enough and long enough to create noticeably different plant communities. So one of our instincts might be to say, well, this needs to be a waterway. Why? I'm going to ask one of my favorite questions, and that question is why? Why does this area need a waterway? Is there erosion that we would need to address? No, there's not. Is there a resource concern that we need to address? The answer to that is yes, but that resource concern is not the fact that the farmer wants to farm more acres. That resource concern is that we have a wetland present on here, which is providing a lot of benefits, infiltration, soil protection. That's why we don't see erosion and all of these other things. So the resource concern here is actually protecting the wetland rather than any other concern at this point. So that's something that's a little difficult for folks to wrap their heads around. Next slide, please. So, you went one too far, please. Yeah. So again, even if you don't know for sure that this area is a wetland, you should be able to recognize that it's different. And then the key to that is once you recognize that it's different, you have to treat it differently, right? Just like we would, if you're looking at a HUA compared to a regular pasture, obviously the two things are different and you're going to treat them differently. So the same applies here. Obviously this area is different from the crop fields around it, so please treat it differently. That's, sort of only logical that we would want to do that, because if we don't, whatever we try to do in this area is going to fail miserably. If we want to treat it like everything else in the landscape around it, it's not going to work because it's not like everything else in the landscape around it. Next slide. So once we think we've found a wetland, how do we deal with them? Well, first and foremost, we have to avoid negative impacts. That's required by law for all federal agencies, almost all state agencies, most county agencies that I'm aware of. Basically, if it boils down to if there are wetlands there, we do everything possible to not have an impact on those wetlands. We just want to stay out of them. That's the best thing that we can do. Let them do their thing. Let them be the way they are. And the reason for that is they're pretty good in most cases. If it's a natural wetland, it's really hard to improve on that. Okay. So if if impacts can be avoided, we do whatever it takes to avoid them, period. There's no wiggle room on this. If you can avoid a wetland, you avoid a wetland. It's just that simple. If that means that you have to change practices, if that means that you have to change your practice layouts, for example, then that's what we do. For those of you with an engineering background, I can hear you thinking, but what about, least cost alternatives and things like that? That doesn't apply with wetlands. We are required, and the requirement is to avoid impacts. All right. It doesn't say to avoid impacts unless it costs more to do so. That's not what any of those laws say. So if we have to reroute a stream crossing walkway or something like that, or if we have to reroute a livestock pipeline to go around a wetland rather than through it, that's exactly what we do, right? Even if it means increasing that layout length by 150 feet and increasing the costs accordingly, that's what we do. That is what we are required to do. Only when negative impacts are unavoidable do we go ahead and impact a wetland. And even then, we have to minimize the impact that we're going to have, and we have to get the appropriate permits from the state and federal agencies if they're necessary. And I can't stress this enough, unavoidable means avoidance is not possible, all right? An example of this might be doing a stream crossing with walkways where the stream is in the bottom of a very flat floodplain, and you've got wetlands on both sides of the stream down the entire length of the stream where we have the option to work on it. That's a fairly common situation, okay? In that case, it's impossible to avoid a wetland because the wetlands are actually located in a place where we can't go around them, and to get to the other side of the stream, we have to go through them. So that would be a case where it's unavoidable, but we would still want to minimize the amount of impacts, and we'd have to get the appropriate permits. So keep in mind, you know, this idea that not preferred is not the same as not possible. So this is something that we fight internally, and we certainly fight it with the landowners sometimes, because the landowner is going to say, I don't want to do a pipeline or a stream crossing in that location over there. I want to do it where it's the easiest. I want a straight line. You know, I want it to go from point A to point B, even if it means crossing that wetland. But if it's possible to go around that wetland and not go across it, that's what we have to do. If the producer or the landowner decides that they don't want to go the long way around, they want to blast right through it, that's up to them. But at that point, we walk away. We cannot assist them with that. And they are still responsible for getting permits to do that work. So for us, just because it's not the preferred alternative, that doesn't matter to us. We still have to do it that way. Okay. Next slide, please. So this gets into the idea of, you know, something that's not preferred doesn't mean that it's not possible. And this is a real world example. This was a horse pasture, and the landowner and the engineer on this one really wanted to locate a gravity trough system at point X, obviously because point X is the lowest point in the landscape. I went out and I told them they had to locate it at point Y. Well, why is that? Because X is obviously a wetland. Remember, we've got soil saturated for a long enough period of time to create a change in the plant community. Area X definitely has those things, right? Soil saturation is obvious from the amount of pugging and depressions in the soil from when the animals walk there. You've got a massive change in plant community because nothing is eating those wildflowers and plants in the background. And, you know, it's a wetland, plain and simple. Yes, it's in the lowest point in the landscape, but that's where wetlands occur most times. So would we be accurate to say that we can't avoid impacts in this situation? No, not at all. We can definitely avoid impacting this wetland simply by going 20 feet to the right and putting that trough on that area where the letter Y is located. Is it going to be a little bit more of a challenge from an engineering standpoint? Yes, probably, because we're probably going to gain a foot or so in elevation from point X to point Y, but that's what we have to do. That's just the way it goes. You know, we can't put it in location X just because it's easier. Life isn't always easy, and this is one of those cases. You know, so many different laws tell us that we can't put it in location X, that if we do, we can really get in some trouble. It has to go in location Y. This is not my personal preference. It's not just my opinion. This is required by law. And actually it is my personal preference. And my reasoning for that is if we put a trough in the area around X, how good is that trough going to last? The trough might be okay, but the area around it is going to get beat up so badly that we couldn't put a big enough pad around that trough. You know, we would essentially have to cover the entire existing wetland with gravel or some sort of hard surfacing, or else it's just going to look like it does now, or worse, because now we're going to have animals drawn to this area more often, an area that they would rather avoid on their own. So yeah, it might be the lowest point in the landscape, but it is not the best place, not the best point to locate a trough. Okay, not only from a legal aspect, but from a common sense aspect as well. Next slide, please. So same property. They were talking about doing an animal trail. They wanted to go from a point on the left, just out of the picture, to that gate that you can see where the hollow arrow ends. They wanted to do a walkway where the path marked X is. Again, I came out, I was the bearer of bad news and told them, no, you can't do that. You have to put it at a slight curve up on the high dry ground following path Y. Not going to beat this horse to death, no pun intended, but the reasoning should be pretty obvious to you by now. Path X was going to take them right through a wetland. And it could that path could easily be avoided by just staying on the high dry ground where path Y is. In terms of building the walkway, which area would we rather build it in? Area X, that walkway is going to almost be a bottomless pit. You know, we're going to have to put tons of fill in there just to stabilize it. Whereas path Y is up on solid ground already. So again, it's not just wetland policy. It's also a large part common sense for something like this. Next slide, please. So, as a quick summary, what are wetlands? Well, you've got the three criteria. You have to have hydrology, hydric soils, and hydrophytic plants. If you're missing one, then you don't have a wetland. Who cares about wetlands? We do. Even if the farmer doesn't, we do. We have to. They are natural resources in and of themselves. They're worth protection. We have to protect them. And we care about them because that's the law. So even if you personally hate wetlands for whatever reason, if you're on the clock, your opinion doesn't matter. I hate to say it that way, but it's true. If you're on the clock, you have to protect wetlands because you're required to by the agency, by the laws, by the Department of Agriculture, the whole way up the chain. You have to do it. It's your job. Well, how do we identify wetlands? Yes, there are technical and expertise ways to do it, but basically for their daily interactions, we want to ask those two questions. Is this area different from everything around it? And then why is it different? If your answer is water, it's different because it's wet, and it's, that's the why of it, is there's so much water there all the time, then guess what? Even if it's not officially a wetland, it's an area that should be treated differently than everything around it because it is different from everything around it. And finally, how do we deal with wetlands? First and foremost, you want to avoid them. Not only is that the requirement, it just makes life so much easier. You don't need permits if you're not going into a wetland. If you're avoiding a wetland, there's nothing to permit. You don't have to deal with a GP6 or a GP9 or any of those things. Why? Because you're not affecting a water body. It's just that simple. So in addition to following our own laws and rules, it can make life a whole lot easier for everybody involved. But if we can't avoid it, then we have to minimize our impacts. We have to we have to do the smallest amount of negative impact possible, and we have to get the required permits for it at that time. Or we have to help the producer or landowner get them, I should say. We do not want to actually file the permits under any of our agency names or anything like that. We can help the participant or the landowner get them, but we are not the permit application or permit applicant. And with that, Tim, I think the next slide is just the question slide. Yep. And if anybody has any questions, or if you want to move right into the prearranged questions, that's fine too.
Any questions for Jim? There's nothing in the chat, so let me share the other item, the questions. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, which of the following does not occur in natural wetlands? And more than one apply, and hopefully it's set up that you can answer more than once. So I'm going to put that in the chat, and I will email it out as well.
Okay, so I wanted to point out, for this one, the question is which of the following does not occur. So it's a little different from what I covered in that you have to be able to think around the situation a little bit.
And while people are answering, Jim, a good question came in the chat. Do you need to have 35 feet fencing around wetland areas?
Not necessarily. That would be the preferred option. But in some cases, it's not required. And the reason I say that it would be the preferred option is that they are considered water bodies, and that as a water body, having a bit of a filter area around them is always a good idea. But the requirement and the law says that it's the wetland that is protected. There's no legal requirement for the area around the wetland.
Have some answers coming in. Looks like loss of valuable productive farmland is a high number, followed by mosquito propagation. And then lastly, followed by landscape connectivity to water corridors.
Right. And everybody is kind of nailing this one right on the head with one exception. So obviously, the idea of, wetlands taking up valuable productive farmland is not correct. Anybody who's tried to grow a crop in wetlands knows that it is almost always a wasted effort because it's just too wet. Most crops cannot survive wet conditions like that, unless they're growing rice or something like that. Crops and standing water don't mix. So when folks say they need every acre to farm or every acre to pasture, they need every productive acre. And wetlands typically are not productive for crops or even for pasture, because as we saw in a lot of those pictures, the animals don't like to go in there. And as a result, the plants that grow in there aren't something they want to eat. So I would make the argument that wetlands are neither cropland or pasture simply because they don't get used that way. They won't grow crops, and given the choice, the animals won't graze them. So you're not really losing productive farmland because it's not productive farmland to start with. Right? The second answer is the mosquito propagation, particularly for West Nile species. This is one that we've heard a lot in recent years, that people say, well, I want to drain that wetland because I know that's where my mosquitoes are coming from. Yes, there will be mosquitoes in wetlands, but no, they will not be the mosquito species that carry West Nile. And that's something that most folks don't know. We tend to think that a mosquito is a mosquito, but they have different species, just like there are different species of birds and different species of mammals, and those species prefer different areas. Just like an owl prefers the forest usually, versus a bluebird preferring grasslands, there are certain species of mosquitoes that prefer stagnant water versus species that prefer water fluctuations. And it's those ones that prefer stagnant water that carry West Nile. And you don't see that in a natural wetland. And that's because they very rarely have standing water. They tend to be, they'll have standing water for a short while after a rain, but then the water gets absorbed and then you just have moist soil conditions. So West Nile literally is not a concern in natural wetlands. The species of mosquitoes that occur there don't carry the disease and won't foster the disease. The last one, landscape connectivity. I actually didn't touch on this in the presentation just because it's one that doesn't get a whole lot of, doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but that actually is true. Because of where they occur in the landscape, they occur down in the lower portions of the landscape, sort of those bottom land draws. They do tend to connect those areas fairly well. You often find wetlands in association with streams and things like that. So that same stream corridor would also include wetlands. So they do play a role in landscape connectivity. It's just maybe not as important as some of those other functions that they provide.
Very good. And then moving on to our last question that I have, wetlands should only be considered during the planning process if they are a primary concern of the farmer, true or false? And that's in the chat. And I believe I sent the email. So got some responses coming in.
Okay, I think we probably have enough responses that we can figure out what the end result is going to be. And most people are answering this question as false, and that is the correct answer. For those 3 of you who said that we should only consider the wetlands if it's a concern of the farmer, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and think that you were probably multitasking during part of this presentation. Because the answer is that, we have to consider wetlands during the planning process, even if the farmer doesn't care one bit about wetlands. It's not a choice. It's our job. It's a requirement of our job. We have to do it. And there's good reasons why we have to do it. So yes, thank you to the 48 folks who got it right. And hopefully the 3 folks who didn't, you've realized your mistake. Maybe you hit the wrong button. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And, just remember from here on out that, yes, we have to consider wetlands. If you're on the clock, you're considering wetlands. That's just the easiest way to remember it. And with that, Tim, I think I'm done unless there's anything in the chat.
No questions. Thank you so much, Jim. That was excellent. I know I appreciate that, and I'm sure all the participants did too. And, that maybe the last question segues into, we are going to have these recordings available. I should have them posted next week, and I'll get an email out when they're ready. They'll most likely be posted to a website for you to retrieve if you would like. And so if you missed any sections or a presentation, or if you had to step away for any reason, you can come back and watch that again. So that will be there. And then another item, we had 2 people that were having trouble with the chat. I don't know why. I think that's a glitch with Teams, but I'm going to try sending a new link. You will get a new link this afternoon for tomorrow's meeting. Earlier this week, we've used the exact same link the first 3 days, and but I want to try something different with a new link and see if that resolves our chat question. So you'll get a new Bootcamp 2 virtual link number 2, and you should be getting that this afternoon, and it'll be ready for you to click on in the morning at 8 o'clock when we start. So with that, I don't have anything else. Oh, Jim, go
actually, ahead. Tim, I wanted to add one more thing.
Sure.
For everybody on the call, for either of the 2 presentations that I gave today, if you have questions or you want some follow-up discussion or whatever, don't hesitate to email me. Let me know those questions and I will gladly work through them with you. It doesn't matter whether you're an NRCS employee or a district employee or anybody else. If there's anything in there that you want some additional work on or some additional help with, don't hesitate to let me know. I will definitely do everything I can to help out.
Thank you, Jim. Excellent. And with that, we will talk to all of you tomorrow. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.